Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The radio crackled at 2:30 p.m. on March 15th, and I knew immediately it wasn't going to be a routine call. 8 years wearing this badge in Yellowstone, and you develop a sixth sense about these things. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret Chen, an elderly woman who was trying real hard to keep it together, but I could hear that tremor underneath every word. Her son David hadn't come back from a day hike with his family in Lamar Valley. They'd left that morning at 8. She said, planning what David had described as just a short nature walk with the grandkids to see some wildlife. Margaret had driven up from Bozeman specifically to meet them at the park. This was supposed to be a 3-generation family outing, something they'd been planning for months. David was a software engineer from Seattle, rarely got time off, and this was his first real vacation in 2 years. Susan taught elementary school and was always talking about wanting to show the kids real nature, not just the sanitized version they saw in picture books. 8-year-old Emma was fascinated by wolves, had been reading everything she could get her hands on about Yellowstone's wolf reintroduction program. 6-year-old Lucas was just excited to be anywhere that might have bears, though Susan had made David promise they'd keep a safe distance from any wildlife they encountered. I grabbed my gear and headed out to the Lamar Valley pullout at mile marker 7.3, that familiar knot already forming in my stomach that comes with missing persons calls. The drive took me 25 minutes through increasingly deteriorating weather conditions. What had started as a clear morning was turning into something nasty, with snow beginning to fall and the temperature dropping fast. The blue Honda Pilot was sitting there like nothing was wrong, positioned carefully between the painted lines, doors locked tight, Susan's purse visible on the passenger seat with her phone right there next to her wallet, 2 booster seats in the back, a few scattered toys, a thermos that probably still had coffee in it. Everything normal except for the fact that the family who owned it had seemingly vanished into thin air. I did my initial walk around of the vehicle, looking for any signs of disturbance or forced entry. Nothing. The car was exactly how you'd expect a family to leave it when departing for a day hike. I checked the registration. David Chen, Seattle address, everything matching what Margaret had told me. I peered through the windows and could see a small cooler in the back, probably packed with sandwiches and juice boxes for the kids. There were maps spread out on the dashboard, guidebooks about Yellowstone wildlife, all the preparation you'd expect from responsible parents taking their children into the wilderness. The weather was turning nasty fast. Clear skies when they started that morning, but now we had snow coming down and the temperature dropping toward what the forecast said would be -12 tonight. David Chen was 35, his wife Susan 32, and they had 2 little ones with them. Emma, 8 years old, and Lucas, 6. According to Margaret, they weren't dressed for anything more than a day hike. David was wearing jeans and a winter jacket. Susan had on snow pants and a fleece. The kids were bundled up in their winter coats, but nothing that would keep them alive in sub-zero temperatures overnight. If they were stuck out there, hypothermia was going to kill them long before we could mount an effective search in the morning. Margaret was waiting in the visitor center, pacing back and forth in that way that worried family members do, checking her phone every 30 seconds like David might suddenly call to say they'd gotten sidetracked at a gift shop somewhere. She kept apologizing for bothering us, saying maybe they'd just lost track of time, but I could see in her eyes that she knew something was wrong. Grandmothers have that instinct about their grandchildren, and Margaret Chen was scared in a way that went deeper than normal parental worry. I radioed dispatch to get additional personnel started our way, then walked the parking area one more time looking for anything I might have missed. The lot was nearly empty. Not unusual for a weekday in March, when most sensible tourists are avoiding Yellowstone's unpredictable late winter weather. A few other vehicles scattered around, but their owners were probably smart enough to be inside the visitor center drinking hot coffee and looking at wildlife exhibits instead of hiking in deteriorating conditions. Rangers Torres and Lopez arrived within 15 minutes, both of them grim-faced because they knew as well as I did what dropping temperatures meant for a missing family. Torres brought the tracking equipment while Lopez started setting up our command post at the parking area. We decided to work outward from the vehicle in expanding circles, looking for any sign of which direction the family had headed when they left their car. The snow conditions were actually perfect for tracking. 4 inches of fresh powder over a solid base, just the right consistency to hold clear impressions. We picked up 4 sets of boot prints almost immediately, heading east from the parking area toward the frozen Lamar River. 2 adults and 2 children, exactly what we were looking for. The prints were well defined, showing normal walking patterns, no signs of distress or hurry. David's boots were size 11 work boots with a distinctive waffle pattern. Susan wore hiking boots with deep lugged soles, and the kids had smaller prints that matched the winter boots Margaret had described them wearing. We followed the trail for about 7/10 of a mile through scattered timber and across open meadow areas. The family had stuck to what most visitors would consider the obvious route, not following any established trail, but taking the path of least resistance toward the scenic river valley. Along the way, we found evidence of their passage that reassured us we were on the right track. A granola bar wrapper caught on a low branch, apparently dropped by accident. Some disturbed snow where one of the adults had stepped off the main line of travel, probably to help one of the children over a fallen log. Everything looked routine, exactly what you'd expect from a family day hike, until we got to the river's edge. That's where things went from routine search and rescue to something I still can't explain 3 months later. The tracks led straight to the river's edge in that same normal walking pattern we'd been following for the better part of a mile. No deviation, no sudden changes in direction, no signs that the family had seen something that spooked them or caused them to alter their course. They approached the water like tourists do everywhere, probably planning to take some photos of the frozen river, maybe throw some snowballs, let the kids experience the novelty of standing on ice thick enough to support their weight. But at exactly 8 feet from the water's edge, all 4 sets of prints just ended. Not like the family had turned around or veered off in another direction. Not like they'd been careful and stepped in each other's footprints to avoid leaving a trail. The tracks simply stopped existing, as if David and Susan and Emma and Lucas had taken one more step and walked right off the edge of the world. Torres spent the better part of an hour examining every inch of that termination point, and I've never seen him as puzzled as he was that afternoon. Mike Torres has been tracking in these mountains for 15 years, worked search and rescue operations from Arizona to Alaska, and he's the guy we call when we need someone found who doesn't want to be found. He can read tracks like most people read newspapers, tell you not just where someone went, but how fast they were moving, whether they were injured, if they were carrying extra weight, sometimes even what kind of mood they were in based on their gait and stride length. But this time, Torres just kept shaking his head and muttering under his breath. No signs of struggle anywhere around the termination point. No slide marks or scuff patterns suggesting someone had fallen through the ice. No evidence of the family backtracking in their own footprints to confuse followers. No tracks leading away from the river in any direction, despite our systematic search of every possible escape route within a 100-yard radius. The snow around the river's edge was completely undisturbed except for those 4 sets of prints leading directly to the water, and then nothing. I walked out onto the ice myself to test its stability. 14 inches thick, solid as concrete. No cracks or weak spots anywhere in the vicinity. The river had been frozen for over a month, and locals had been using this section for ice fishing without any problems. If the Chen family had tried to cross the river, their tracks would have been clearly visible on the other side. But there were no tracks on the other side. There were no tracks anywhere except the ones that led to that impossible stopping point. That's when Lopez found the first piece of evidence downstream from the termination point, a pink mitten with unicorns on it, buried partially under fresh snow about 15 feet from where the tracks ended. According to Margaret's description, this was definitely Emma's mitten. The little girl had been so proud of those unicorns, had insisted on wearing them even though they didn't match her coat. The mitten was dry, showed no signs of having been in the snow for very long, and appeared to have been dropped recently rather than lost hours earlier. We marked the location and continued searching downstream, establishing a systematic grid pattern to cover every inch of the riverbank. Lopez found Lucas's winter boot wedged against a fallen tree another 30 feet downstream. Just one boot, the left one, size 12 with Velcro straps that a 6-year-old could manage by himself. The boot was empty, no sock inside, no signs of violence or forcible removal, like someone had simply stepped out of it and kept walking. Torres discovered an adult leather glove, black, men's size, extra large, caught on some brush near the water's edge. The glove matched Margaret's description of what David had been wearing, and like the other items, it appeared recently dropped. No weathering, no animal disturbance, no indication it had been exposed to the elements for more than a few hours at most. We found a partial wrapper from a granola bar of the same brand Margaret said Susan always packed for family outings. A child's wool sock, pink with white stripes, that belonged to Emma. A lens cap from a camera that David had been carrying. All of these items were scattered along the riverbank downstream from the point where the tracks ended, like someone had been walking along the water's edge, dropping belongings as they went. But there were no tracks along the riverbank, no footprints in the snow to indicate anyone had walked in the direction where we were finding these personal items. It was as if the belongings had been placed there by someone who could walk without leaving footprints, or had fallen from the sky in a neat line extending downstream from the family's last known location. By 4 o'clock, we had expanded the search and brought in additional personnel. SAR Team Alpha arrived with 4 specialists trained in technical rescue operations. We called in the K-9 unit from Mammoth Hot Springs, and helicopter support was standing by if weather conditions improved enough to allow safe flying. I had Rangers Williams and Park working a wider perimeter search, checking every possible shelter location within a 2-mile radius. Rock overhangs, tree wells, thermal features, anywhere a family might have taken refuge if they'd gotten lost or injured. The K-9 unit arrived just after 4:30, handler Karen Martinez bringing Rex, a 6-year-old bloodhound with more successful search operations under his belt than any dog in the region. Martinez gave Rex scent articles from the Chen vehicle, a child's stuffed animal that smelled like Emma, a jacket from the back seat that belonged to David. Rex picked up the scent trail immediately, following the exact same path we'd tracked visually from the parking area to the river's edge. But when Rex reached that termination point where the footprints disappeared, something spooked him in a way I'd never seen before. This dog had tracked missing persons through blizzards, found bodies in avalanche debris, located injured hikers in conditions that would challenge most humans. Rex was as steady and reliable as they come, never distracted by wildlife scent or confused by conflicting trails. At the river's edge, Rex began acting like he was following a scent trail that led directly into the water. He would approach the termination point, start to follow the scent over the ice, then stop abruptly and back away with his tail between his legs. Martinez encouraged him to continue, but Rex refused to go any further toward the river. The dog was whining and pacing, clearly agitated, acting like he was being asked to follow a trail that led somewhere he absolutely would not go. Martinez worked with Rex for over an hour, trying different approaches, letting him rest and restart, even bringing him back to the vehicle to get fresh scent articles. Every time the result was the same. Rex would follow the trail to that specific point where the tracks ended, indicate that the scent continued over the ice, then refuse to pursue it any further. According to Martinez, this was completely unprecedented behavior for this particular dog. What made Rex's behavior even more disturbing was that he seemed to be indicating the scent trail led not just onto the ice, but under it. Several times he tried to dig at the exact spot where the tracks terminated, pawing at the snow like he was trying to reach something beneath the surface. But we'd already verified that the ice was solid, and there was no evidence that anyone had broken through or that the surface had been disturbed in any way. As the afternoon wore on, and we continued to find scattered belongings but no sign of the family themselves, I started getting that sick feeling in my stomach that comes with searches that aren't going to have happy endings. The temperature was dropping steadily. Wind was picking up, and visibility was getting worse by the hour. Even if the Chen family was still alive and mobile, they were dressed for a day hike, not an overnight survival situation in sub-zero conditions. We found more items scattered downstream from the termination point. A child's wool sock that belonged to Emma, found wrapped around a branch 20 feet from where we'd discovered her mitten. A lens cap from David's camera, the expensive digital camera that Margaret said he'd brought specifically to photograph wildlife for the kids. Susan's lip balm, the kind with SPF protection that elementary school teachers always carry because they spend so much time outdoors during recess duty. A granola bar wrapper, the same brand that Margaret said Susan always packed for family outings because the kids would actually eat them without complaining. Every item appeared recently dropped, showing no signs of weathering or prolonged exposure to snow and wind. No animal disturbance, no indication that these belongings had been scattered by scavengers or predators. They were positioned along the riverbank like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale, except there was no trail to follow, no footprints to indicate how they'd gotten there or who had been carrying them when they were dropped. By 5:30, with darkness approaching and weather conditions deteriorating rapidly, we had to make the decision that no search and rescue coordinator wants to make. The wind chill was approaching -20. Visibility was down to less than 50 yards, and we were risking the safety of our search teams by keeping them in the field. I made the call to suspend active search operations until first light, when we could bring in additional resources and hopefully get helicopter support if the storm system moved through overnight. We secured the area and posted a night patrol at the parking lot in case the family somehow made it back to their vehicle during the night. I knew it was a long shot. If they were still alive after 8 hours in these conditions, they would have found a way to signal for help or make their way back to the road by now. But hope is part of the job, even when logic tells you that hope is probably wasted effort. I drove back to the visitor center to update Margaret on our search efforts, dreading the conversation I was about to have. She was still there, of course, still pacing, still checking her phone every few minutes like David might suddenly call to say they'd gotten lost but were fine and heading back to the car. When she saw my expression, I watched something die in her eyes. That last bit of hope that maybe this was all just a misunderstanding. That maybe her son and his family were just running late or had taken a longer hike than planned. I told her about the tracks, about finding the scattered belongings, about the search being suspended until morning. I didn't tell her about Rex's behavior or about how impossible the whole situation seemed from a logical perspective. There's no point in adding to a family member's anguish by describing details that don't make sense even to experienced search professionals. Margaret asked me the question that family members always ask in these situations, the one that never gets easier to answer. Do you think they're still alive? I gave her the answer I always give, the one that's technically true even when you know better. We're going to do everything we can to find them, and we're not giving up until we do. She nodded like she believed me, but I could see in her face that she understood what 8 hours in these weather conditions meant for 4 people dressed for a day hike. The next morning brought 6 inches of fresh snow that effectively erased any remaining evidence at the search site. We brought in helicopters as soon as weather permitted, expanded the search area to over 30 square miles, called in specialists from 3 different agencies. We interviewed every visitor who had been in Lamar Valley on March 15th, checked with park entrance stations to see if anyone had seen the Chen family leaving the park, reviewed security camera footage from visitor centers and ranger stations. We found nothing. No additional tracks, no more scattered belongings, no witnesses who had seen the family after they left their car that morning. It was as if David and Susan Chen and their 2 children had walked to that spot by the Lamar River and then ceased to exist in any meaningful way. The investigation continued for 3 weeks, with federal authorities taking over from Park Service personnel. Search teams covered hundreds of square miles, brought in ground-penetrating radar to check for possible underground cavities or hidden spaces where the family might have fallen or taken shelter. Divers were brought in to search the river itself, even though the ice conditions made it impossible for anyone to have entered the water voluntarily or accidentally. Margaret Chen stayed in the area for 2 weeks, checking with us every day to see if there were any new developments. I think she knew we weren't going to find her family alive, but she couldn't bring herself to leave as long as there was any chance they might still be out there somewhere needing help. When she finally went back to Bozeman, she left her contact information and made me promise to call if we found anything at all, even if it was just more personal belongings. I've worked search and rescue operations for 8 years, and I've seen every kind of disappearance you can imagine. Visitors who wander off established trails and get lost in areas where they all look the same. Falls from cliff faces where people get too close to edges trying to take photographs. Animal attacks, though those are rare and usually leave clear evidence of what happened. Medical emergencies where someone has a heart attack or stroke in the backcountry and can't call for help. Equipment failures. Weather-related incidents. Cases where people simply make poor decisions and end up in situations they can't handle. But this was different. This was 4 people, including 2 small children, walking to a specific point, and then simply ceasing to exist. No tracks beyond the termination point, no blood evidence, no signs of struggle or violence, no logical explanation for their disappearance. The scattered belongings suggested something had happened to them, but the absence of any other evidence suggested nothing had happened at all. 3 months later, I still find myself thinking about the Chen family case at least once a week. I've reviewed the evidence files dozens of times, looking for something I might have missed, some detail that could explain how 4 people vanish from a spot where there's nowhere to go. I've consulted with tracking experts from other agencies, shared the case details with investigators who have worked similar disappearances, even reached out to academics who study anomalous missing persons cases in national parks. Nobody has been able to offer a satisfactory explanation for what happened to David and Susan Chen and their children. The case has been classified as an unexplained disappearance and filed with federal authorities, but it remains open and active. Officially, the investigation continues, though in practical terms, there's nothing left to investigate. We've searched every possible location, interviewed every potential witness, examined every piece of available evidence. The Chen family simply walked to that spot by the Lamar River on March 15th, and then stopped existing in any way that makes sense according to our understanding of how the physical world works. 4 sets of tracks leading to nowhere, a search dog that refused to follow a scent trail that led under solid ice, and personal belongings scattered along a riverbank where no one had walked. Sometimes, when I'm doing patrol in Lamar Valley late at night, I drive past that pullout where their Honda Pilot was parked. The area has been searched dozens of times since then by multiple agencies using every available technology, but I still find myself looking for any sign of them. Because somewhere out there, David and Susan Chen and their 2 children either found their way to some place we can't follow, or something found them that we can't explain. And the worst part is knowing that we may never find out which one it was. Margaret Chen calls me every few weeks to ask if there have been any new developments. I always tell her that the case remains active, that we haven't given up, that we'll contact her immediately if we learn anything new. But what I don't tell her is that I've come to believe we've already found everything we're going to find. 4 sets of tracks leading to an impossible vanishing point, and scattered belongings pointing toward an explanation that doesn't exist. In 8 years of working search and rescue in Yellowstone, the Chen family disappearance is the only case I've encountered that defies logical explanation. It's the only investigation where all the evidence points toward something that can't be true, and the absence of evidence suggests nothing happened at all. And it's the one case that makes me wonder, late at night when I'm alone in the park, whether there are places in these mountains where the normal rules simply don't apply. I'm writing this in my cabin at Olympic National Park, and my hands are still shaking. I've been staring at this blank page for 20 minutes trying to figure out how to explain what happened today. But I guess I'll just start from the beginning, and hope it makes sense when I read it back tomorrow morning. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and I've been a ranger here for 3 years now. Before that, I worked construction in Tacoma for 15 years, until a back injury forced me to find something else to do with my life. Being a park ranger wasn't exactly my childhood dream, but I've come to love the work, especially the solitude you get in places like Olympic, where you can go days without seeing another human being. At 42 years old, I thought I'd seen enough of the world to handle whatever nature could throw at me. Today proved me wrong. It started as a routine morning patrol on the Sol Duke River Trail. Summer solstice was coming up this weekend, which meant we'd be getting more visitors than usual, people wanting to experience the longest day of the year in one of the most beautiful places in Washington state. My job was to check the backcountry campsites, make sure nobody was camping illegally, clean up any trash that inconsiderate visitors might have left behind, and generally keep an eye on things before the weekend crowds arrived. I left the ranger station at 7 a.m. sharp. Perfect weather for hiking. Sunny skies, temperature in the mid-60s, light breeze coming off the Pacific that made the whole forest smell like salt and pine. The Sol Duke Trail winds through some of the most pristine old-growth forest in the park. Massive Douglas firs and western red cedars that have been standing for centuries, some of them probably growing here when Lewis and Clark were exploring the region. It's the kind of place that makes you feel small and insignificant in the best possible way. The first few miles of patrol went exactly as expected. I checked 3 established campsites and found them empty and clean. Picked up a few pieces of litter near the river crossing where day hikers sometimes stop for lunch. Made some notes about a fallen tree that was partially blocking the trail, something maintenance would need to address before the weekend. Normal ranger stuff, the kind of routine work that most people would find boring, but that I've learned to appreciate for its predictability. Around 9:30, I reached the backcountry area where overnight campers are supposed to register if they're planning to stay more than one night. This is about 6 miles from the trailhead, far enough out that you don't get casual hikers, only people who are serious about spending time in the wilderness. The registration box was empty, which wasn't unusual for a Tuesday in June, but as I was closing it back up, I heard voices coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. Now, voices in the wilderness aren't necessarily cause for alarm. Could be day hikers who started early, could be campers breaking down their site after an overnight stay. But something about these voices bothered me right away. They were too loud for one thing, carrying farther than voices should in dense forest. And there was something about the tone that didn't sound right, like people who were arguing but trying to keep their voices down at the same time. I decided to investigate, partly because it's my job to check on visitors and make sure they're following park regulations, but mostly because those voices were setting off alarm bells in my head for reasons I couldn't explain. I left the main trail and headed in the direction of the sound, following what looked like an old game trail that wound between the massive tree trunks and through patches of ferns that grew waist-high in the filtered sunlight. The voices got clearer as I got closer, and I could make out what sounded like a man and woman having some kind of disagreement. I couldn't make out specific words, but the man's voice sounded angry while the woman sounded scared. That combination is never good news in my experience, especially when you're miles from civilization and there's no easy way to call for help if things go wrong. I was moving as quietly as possible, trying to get close enough to assess the situation before making my presence known. In domestic dispute situations, sometimes the arrival of authority figures can escalate things in dangerous ways, so I wanted to understand what I was dealing with before announcing myself as a park ranger. The last thing I wanted was to walk into the middle of something that could turn violent. After about 10 minutes of careful hiking through the undergrowth, I spotted them through the trees. A man and woman, probably in their 30s, standing next to what looked like a makeshift campsite in a small clearing about 50 yards ahead of me. But something about the scene looked wrong immediately. The campsite wasn't set up like any camping arrangement I'd ever seen before. No tent, no sleeping bags, just a small pile of gear scattered around like it had been dumped there in a hurry. The woman was wearing jeans and a light jacket, normal hiking clothes, but she was standing with her arms crossed like she was cold despite the warm morning temperature. The man was dressed in dark clothing, cargo pants, and a long-sleeve shirt that seemed too heavy for the weather. He was gesturing angrily while he talked, pointing at the woman, and then at something I couldn't see from my position. What really caught my attention was that neither of them had backpacks or any of the gear you'd expect to see with people who had hiked 6 miles into the backcountry. No water bottles, no day packs, no hiking poles. It was like they had somehow appeared in this remote location without actually hiking there, which made no sense given that there were no roads or other access points anywhere near this area. I was trying to decide how to approach the situation when the man suddenly grabbed the woman by the arm and started pulling her toward a stand of trees on the far side of the clearing. She was resisting, trying to pull away from him, and I could hear her saying no repeatedly, even though I still couldn't make out most of their words. That's when I knew I had to intervene, regardless of whether it might escalate the situation. I stepped out from behind the tree where I'd been observing and called out in my most authoritative ranger voice, "Park Service, I need both of you to stop what you're doing and stay where you are." The effect was immediate and completely unexpected. The man released the woman's arm and both of them turned to look at me. But instead of the surprise or concern you'd expect from people who'd been caught in a confrontation, they both looked terrified. Not embarrassed or angry about being interrupted, but genuinely frightened, like I was the threat they'd been worried about all along. The woman started backing away from both me and the man, moving toward the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing. The man just stood there staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between confusion and panic. For a long moment, nobody said anything, and I had the strangest feeling that I had walked into the middle of something much more complicated than a domestic dispute between campers. "I'm Ranger Rodriguez," I called out, trying to sound calm and professional. "I'm just doing routine patrol of the area. Are you folks registered for backcountry camping?" It was a standard question, the kind of thing I asked dozens of visitors every week, but the response I got was anything but standard. The man looked at the woman, then back at me, then said in a voice that was barely loud enough for me to hear, "We're not supposed to be here." Not that they hadn't registered. Not that they were just day hiking, but that they weren't supposed to be there at all. Like they had somehow ended up in this remote location against their will, or by accident. The woman had reached the edge of the clearing and was looking back and forth between me and the man, like she was trying to decide which one of us represented the bigger threat. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days, and there was something about her posture that suggested she was injured or in pain. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear her. "Please," she said, "we need help getting out of here. We've been lost for 3 days." 3 days. That stopped me cold because it raised immediate questions that didn't have good answers. If they'd been lost for 3 days, where was their camping gear? Where were their supplies? How had they survived 3 nights in the wilderness without proper equipment? And if they'd been lost for 3 days, why hadn't anyone reported them missing? Most importantly, how had they gotten 6 miles into the backcountry without following any of the established trails? I started walking toward them, keeping my movements slow and non-threatening. But as soon as I took the first step, the man panicked. "Don't come any closer," he shouted, and there was real fear in his voice. "You don't understand what's happening here." That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The scattered gear I'd seen when I first spotted their campsite wasn't camping equipment at all. It was personal belongings, a purse, some clothing, a pair of shoes, arranged in a way that looked deliberate, like someone had been going through the contents methodically. And lying next to the pile of belongings was something that definitely didn't belong in a wilderness setting, a manila folder with papers scattered around it. I was close enough now to see that the papers were official documents, the kind with government letterhead and multiple signatures. Without being able to read the specific content, I could see enough to know these weren't the kind of documents that hikers typically carry into the backcountry. The man noticed me looking at the papers and quickly moved to block my view, but not before I caught sight of what looked like photographs mixed in with the documents. "Sir, I need you to step away from those materials and keep your hands where I can see them," I said, falling back on my law enforcement training. Something about this situation was very wrong, and my instincts were telling me that these people weren't lost campers in need of assistance. The woman might be in genuine distress, but the man was acting like someone who had something to hide. The man looked at the scattered documents, then at the woman, then back at me. For a moment I thought he was going to comply, but instead he did something that caught me completely off guard. He started laughing. Not the nervous laughter of someone in an awkward situation, but genuine, uncontrolled laughter, like someone who had just heard the funniest joke of their life. "You think I'm the problem here?" he said between laughs. "You think I'm the one she needs to be afraid of?" He gestured toward the woman, who was now pressed against a large cedar tree at the edge of the clearing like she was trying to disappear into the bark. "Ask her what those documents are. Ask her why we've really been out here for 3 days." The woman shook her head frantically and started saying, "No, no, no," over and over again. But the man kept talking. "Go ahead," he called to me. "Look at the papers. Look at the photographs. Then ask her to explain why she brought me out here to show me evidence that my 8-year-old daughter didn't die in a car accident like she told me." Everything stopped. The forest went completely silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I looked at the woman, who had slid down the tree trunk and was now sitting on the ground with her head in her hands. I looked at the man, who had stopped laughing and was staring at me with an expression of absolute despair. I looked at the scattered documents and realized that I had stumbled into something far worse than a domestic dispute or a case of lost hikers. "My daughter Emma disappeared from a campground 3 years ago," the man continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. "This woman told me she was a social worker who had been investigating the case. She said she had new evidence about what really happened, but that it was too dangerous to discuss anywhere near civilization. She convinced me to meet her out here where no one could overhear us or interfere with her investigation." I was still processing this information when the woman looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "He's not telling you everything," she said. "Those documents prove that Emma Chen didn't die in a car accident. They prove that her father sold her to people who do things to children. And when I confronted him with the evidence, he threatened to kill me if I ever told anyone what I knew." The name hit me like a physical blow. Emma Chen. I knew that name because every ranger in the Pacific Northwest knew that name. 3 years ago, 8-year-old Emma Chen had disappeared from a family camping trip at Lake Crescent, less than 20 miles from where we were standing. Massive search operation, hundreds of volunteers, weeks of media coverage. The case had never been solved, and Emma Chen had never been found. "You're David Chen," I said, looking at the man with new understanding. He nodded slowly, and I could see the exhaustion and desperation in his face that comes from 3 years of living with unspeakable loss. "And you are?" I asked the woman. My name is Sarah Mitchell, she said, still sitting against the tree. I'm a private investigator. Emma's grandmother hired me 6 months ago to look into the case because she never believed the official story about what happened to her granddaughter. I was trying to process this information and figure out what my role should be in what was clearly a very complicated situation when David Chen said something that made everything even more confusing. The problem is, he said, looking directly at me, I never had a daughter named Emma Chen. I don't know who this woman really is or why she brought me out here, but everything she's told me is a lie. And now she's trying to convince you that I'm some kind of child killer to cover up whatever her real agenda is. The forest around us seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I looked at Sarah Mitchell, who was shaking her head and pointing at the scattered documents. I looked at David Chen, who was standing perfectly still with his hands at his sides but ready to run or fight depending on what I did next. I looked at the manila folder and the photographs and the personal belongings scattered around the makeshift campsite, and I realized that I had no idea which one of them was telling the truth, or if either of them was telling the truth. What I did know was that I was 6 miles from the nearest backup, completely alone with 2 people who were either victims or perpetrators of something very serious, and that my next decision could determine whether someone lived or died. That's when I heard the sound that made everything infinitely worse. A child's voice, calling for help, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. A little girl's voice, crying, "Daddy, help me! Daddy, I'm scared!" Both David Chen and Sarah Mitchell turned toward the sound with expressions of absolute horror. David started running toward the voice before I could stop him, crashing through the underbrush and shouting, "Emma! Emma, where are you?" Sarah was right behind him, and I had no choice but to follow. We ran through the forest for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, following the sound of the child's voice as it seemed to move farther and farther away from us. The voice was always just out of reach, just beyond the next stand of trees, just over the next ridge. David was calling his daughter's name, and Sarah was shouting for him to wait, to be careful. But the voice kept leading us deeper into the wilderness. Finally, we reached a part of the forest where the trees were so thick that very little sunlight filtered through to the ground. The undergrowth was sparse, and the forest floor was covered with decades of fallen needles that muffled every sound. And that's where the child's voice stopped. We stood there in the dim light, breathing hard, listening for any sound that might tell us which direction to go next. But there was nothing. Complete silence except for our own labored breathing and the distant sound of wind in the treetops high above us. "Emma," David called softly. "Emma, are you there?" No response. We waited for several minutes, but the voice that had led us here was gone. And that's when Sarah Mitchell said something that made my blood turn to ice water. "David," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "your daughter Emma has been dead for 3 years. Whoever was calling for help, it wasn't her." I'm back in my cabin now, writing this down while the events are still fresh in my memory. We never found the source of the child's voice. We never figured out who Sarah Mitchell really was or whether David Chen was telling the truth about not having a daughter. The scattered documents and photographs disappeared while we were chasing the voice through the forest, and by the time we made it back to the clearing, there was no evidence that anyone had ever been there. I escorted both of them back to the ranger station and called in the incident to my supervisor. Sarah Mitchell provided identification that checked out, and her story about being a private investigator hired by Emma Chen's grandmother was verified. David Chen also provided valid identification, but when we ran his information through our databases, there was no record of him ever being connected to a missing child case. They were both released after questioning, and I filed a report about the incident. But the report doesn't mention the child's voice we heard in the forest, because I know how that would sound to people who weren't there. It doesn't mention the way the forest fell completely silent when we were chasing that voice, or the fact that we never found any trace of whoever was calling for help. I've been thinking about it all day, and I keep coming back to the same question. If Emma Chen has been dead for 3 years, who was calling for her daddy in the woods today? And why did that voice sound so much like a frightened child who needed help that 3 adults would chase it for miles through dense forest without stopping to think about whether what we were hearing was possible? Tomorrow, I'm going to request the case files for Emma Chen's disappearance. I need to know what really happened to that little girl 3 years ago, and I need to understand why her case led 2 strangers into the middle of Olympic National Park today. Because something tells me that what happened in those woods was connected to her disappearance in ways that I don't want to think about. But right now, I'm going to try to get some sleep, even though I know I'm going to be listening for that child's voice every time the wind moves through the trees outside my window. She was standing exactly where she couldn't be, and that's when I knew this wasn't going to be a normal day at Arches National Park. The morning started routinely enough. Clear November skies, temperature around 55 degrees, perfect weather for the search and rescue training exercise we had scheduled. My team was supposed to spend the day practicing rope rescue techniques in the fiery furnace area, but instead we ended up investigating one of the most bizarre discoveries I've encountered in my 12 years as a ranger. My name is Travis Coleman, and I've been working at Arches since I finished my degree in outdoor recreation at Utah State. I'm 34 years old now, married with 2 kids, and I've always prided myself on being the kind of ranger who can handle whatever the desert throws at me. Flash floods, heat emergencies, rock falls, lost tourists. I've dealt with all of it. But what my search team found on November 18th challenged everything I thought I understood about how missing persons investigations work. The training exercise was scheduled to begin at 8 a.m., with 6 team members practicing technical rescue scenarios in the narrow canyons and rock formations that make Arches both beautiful and dangerous. We'd been planning this exercise for months, using it as an opportunity to test new equipment and train newer team members on advanced rescue techniques. But when we arrived at our designated training area, we discovered that someone had beaten us there. A complete camp setup positioned in a location that was not only illegal for camping, but physically impossible for anyone to have reached with the amount of gear we were looking at. The campsite was located on a narrow rock ledge about 80 feet above the canyon floor, accessible only by technical climbing or rappelling from the rim above. But the rim in that area was over 200 feet higher than the ledge, meaning anyone reaching that spot would have needed specialized equipment and considerable technical skills. What we found was a family camping setup that looked like it had been transported there by helicopter. 3 tents of different sizes, obviously meant for parents and children. Camp chairs, a portable table, cooking equipment, enough gear to support a family of 4 or 5 for several days. Everything was arranged as if this impossible location was just another designated campground. The gear itself was all high quality but showed signs of recent use. The tents were properly staked and guy-lined, positioned to take advantage of morning sun and afternoon shade. There was even a camp kitchen area with a portable stove and organized food storage, all set up according to leave-no-trace principles despite being in a location where camping wasn't permitted. But there was no family, no people anywhere in the area, no sign of how anyone could have gotten all this equipment to a ledge that required technical climbing skills to reach. We spent an hour searching the immediate area, looking for any indication of where the campers might have gone or how they'd accessed this location. My team leader, Sarah Mitchell, has 20 years of search and rescue experience and specializes in technical rope rescue. She examined the rock face above and below the ledge, looking for any evidence of climbing activity or rope anchors that would indicate how someone had reached the campsite. "Coleman," she said, after completing her assessment, "this doesn't make sense. There are no fixed anchors above this ledge, no signs of recent climbing activity, no worn spots on the rock that would indicate regular use of this area for technical access. But that gear didn't levitate up here by itself." We inventoried everything we found at the campsite, hoping to identify who might have been camping there. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the tents. clothes for 2 adults and 3 children, toiletries, medications with prescription labels. The names on the prescription bottles were Williams, apparently a family from Phoenix who had driven to Utah for a vacation. The camping gear was arranged like a family had been living there for several days. Food storage indicated they'd been eating regular meals, and there was evidence of a campfire that had been properly extinguished. Sleeping bags were laid out in the tents like people had been using them regularly, and personal items were organized the way you'd expect from an experienced camping family. But there were several things about the campsite that didn't make sense beyond the impossible location. The food storage contained mostly fresh items that wouldn't last more than a day or two in desert conditions without refrigeration. Milk, sandwich meat, fresh vegetables, items that experienced campers wouldn't bring on an extended wilderness trip. There was also camping gear that seemed inappropriate for the location and season. Beach chairs designed for sand rather than rock surfaces. A large family-sized tent that would be difficult to anchor securely on the narrow ledge. Summer-weight clothing, despite the fact that November nights in the Utah desert can drop below freezing. We found identification for Robert Williams, his wife Jennifer, and their 3 children. Emma, age 12, Luke, age 10, and Sophie, age 8. Driver's licenses, credit cards, vehicle registration for a Honda Pilot with Arizona plates. Everything you'd expect a family to have with them on a camping trip, except the family themselves. Sarah contacted Park Dispatch to run the vehicle registration and check if the Williams family had been reported missing. While we waited for information, the rest of the team continued searching the area for any clue about where the family might have gone or how they'd reached this location. The search expanded to include the canyon floor below the ledge and the rim area above. We were looking for any sign of climbing equipment, rope anchors, or alternative access routes that might explain how a family with 3 young children had managed to reach an essentially inaccessible location with enough gear for an extended camping trip. We found nothing. No climbing equipment anywhere in the area, no signs of recent technical activity, no alternative routes that would allow access to the ledge without specialized mountaineering skills. The Williams family had somehow established a complete campsite in a location that should have been impossible for them to reach. The response from dispatch was even more confusing. The Honda Pilot registered to Robert Williams had been found abandoned in the Delicate Arch parking area 3 days earlier. Park Service had impounded the vehicle after it sat in the parking lot for 48 hours beyond the maximum permitted time, assuming the owners had either extended their stay or left the park by other means. But according to park entrance records, the Williams family had never checked in at any visitor center, never registered for backcountry camping, never appeared on any permit lists or reservation systems. As far as official records were concerned, they had never been in Arches National Park at all. Sarah made the decision to treat this as a missing persons case and called in additional resources. Within 2 hours, we had dog teams, additional search and rescue personnel, and a helicopter conducting aerial searches of the surrounding area. The Williams family campsite became the center of one of the largest search operations conducted in the park that year. But after 3 days of intensive searching, we found no trace of the Williams family anywhere in the region. No tracks leading away from the impossible campsite, no signs that they'd been anywhere else in the park, no indication of where they might have gone or what might have happened to them. The search dogs were particularly confused by the scene at the campsite. They picked up clear scent trails indicating that multiple people had been present on the ledge recently, but the trails seemed to circle around the campsite without leading anywhere else. According to the dog handlers, it was like the family had been present at that location, but had never approached it from any direction or left it by any route. On the 4th day of the search, we received information that changed the entire nature of the investigation. Robert Williams had contacted Arches National Park from his home in Phoenix, asking about retrieving camping gear that he claimed had been stolen from his vehicle while visiting the park. According to Williams, his family had driven to Utah for a day trip to see Delicate Arch, but had never planned to camp in the park. They'd left their vehicle in the parking area for a few hours while hiking, and when they returned, camping gear had been taken from their car's roof storage. The family had driven home to Phoenix that same day, never spending a night in the park. Williams had no explanation for how his family's personal belongings had ended up at a campsite they claimed never to have established. When Park Service personnel interviewed the family by phone, none of them had any memory of camping at Arches or setting up the elaborate campsite we'd discovered. The children's accounts were particularly confusing. When asked about their recent trip to Utah, they described a normal day hike to Delicate Arch and the drive home to Phoenix. But when shown photographs of the personal belongings we'd found at the campsite, they recognized clothes, toys, and other items as definitely belonging to them. Medical examinations found no signs of injury or drug use in any family members, but psychological evaluation suggested possible shared dissociative episode related to family stress. The official explanation was that the family had experienced some kind of collective memory loss related to a traumatic incident during their visit to the park. But that explanation doesn't account for the physical impossibility of the campsite location, or the fresh condition of the gear when we found it. A family of 5 with 3 young children couldn't have reached that ledge without technical climbing equipment and skills that none of them possessed. And even if they had somehow accessed the location, they couldn't have transported enough gear for a multi-day campsite without multiple trips using specialized hauling systems. The camping gear was eventually returned to the Williams family, but the case was never officially resolved. The incident report classified it as an unexplained discovery, with no evidence of criminal activity or safety violations. But everyone involved in the search operation knew that we'd encountered something that defied logical explanation. I've been thinking about this case for months now, and I keep coming back to the fundamental question of how that campsite existed in a location where it couldn't exist. The Williams family had never been trained in technical climbing, had no specialized equipment, and according to their own account, had never planned to camp in the park at all. Yet, we found a complete family campsite, obviously used for several days, positioned on a ledge that required advanced mountaineering skills to access. Personal belongings that definitely belonged to the Williams family, arranged exactly as you'd expect from experienced campers, in a location they couldn't have reached and apparently had never visited. Sometimes when I'm conducting training exercises in the fiery furnace area, I look up at that ledge where we found the impossible campsite. The location has been thoroughly searched since then, and there's no remaining evidence that anyone was ever there. But I know what my team found, and I know that it represents something that falls outside normal categories of explainable incidents. The Williams family returned to their normal lives in Phoenix with no memory of camping at Arches National Park. But somewhere in the Utah desert, there was evidence that they had established a campsite in a location they couldn't have reached, using gear they claimed was stolen during a visit they insisted had never involved camping. That's the kind of contradiction that keeps me awake at night, wondering if there are other impossible campsites hidden in remote locations throughout the park system, and whether the families who established them have any memory of how they got there or why they left. My last day before retirement was supposed to be quiet paperwork and handing over keys to my replacement, but instead I got the strangest report I've handled in 31 years of working at Zion National Park. The call came in at 1:47 p.m. on December 12th, temperature dropping fast with storm clouds building over the canyon walls. Winter in Zion means fewer visitors and more unpredictable weather, which usually translates to a peaceful end-of-season routine for those of us getting ready to hang up our badges. The caller was a woman named Helen Patterson, 73 years old, visiting from Kansas City with her adult son, David. They'd driven out to Utah specifically to hike Angel's Landing, something Helen had wanted to do since her husband passed away 2 years earlier. According to her, it was supposed to be a memorial trip, a way to honor his memory by completing a hike they'd planned to do together before his heart attack. Helen was calling from the Emerald Pools trailhead, clearly shaken up and asking for immediate assistance with what she described as a very serious situation involving my deceased husband. The way she said it made me think we were dealing with someone who was having a grief-related psychological episode, maybe seeing things that weren't there because of the emotional significance of the trip. I've dealt with plenty of emotional situations over the years. Families scattering ashes in places where it's not permitted, people having breakdowns at scenic viewpoints that held special meaning for lost loved ones, visitors who become convinced they've seen or heard deceased relatives in natural settings that remind them of better times. It's part of the job, and usually it just requires patience and compassion to help people work through their grief. But when I met Helen Patterson at the Emerald Pools parking area, she was remarkably composed for someone who was supposedly having hallucinations about her dead husband. She was a small woman, maybe 5'2", wearing appropriate hiking gear and carrying a day pack that suggested she was an experienced hiker despite her age. Her son David was with her, probably 50 years old, and he looked more confused than concerned about his mother's mental state. "Officer," Helen said as soon as I introduced myself, "I need you to understand that I'm not having a breakdown or seeing things that aren't there. My husband Frank has been guiding people on the Riverside Walk for the past hour, and he's been dead for 2 years." David immediately jumped in to explain that his mother was understandably emotional about being in a place that held special meaning for his father, and that grief sometimes manifests in ways that seem real to the person experiencing them. He was clearly trying to smooth over what he assumed was his mother's psychological distress. But Helen cut him off with the kind of authoritative tone that suggested she was used to being taken seriously. "My son thinks I'm losing my mind," she said, looking directly at me. "But I know what I saw, and I know that other people saw it too. Frank Patterson, my husband who died of a heart attack on March 15, 2022, spent this morning leading a group of tourists on the Riverside Walk Trail, pointing out rock formations and wildlife exactly the way he used to do when we visited national parks together." I asked Helen to start from the beginning and tell me exactly what she'd observed, using the kind of calm, professional tone I'd developed over 3 decades of dealing with distraught visitors. In my experience, the best way to handle these situations is to listen carefully and gather as much information as possible before deciding how to respond. According to Helen, she and David had started hiking the Riverside Walk around 11 a.m., planning to complete the easy trail before attempting the more challenging Angel's Landing route later in the day. The Riverside Walk is our most accessible trail, a paved path that follows the Virgin River and attracts visitors of all ages and fitness levels. About halfway along the trail, they'd encountered a group of 8 or 10 people gathered around a tall man in hiking clothes who was pointing out features of the landscape and discussing the geological history of Zion Canyon. Helen had stopped to listen because the man was obviously knowledgeable about the area and was giving what sounded like an informal guided tour. "That's when I realized I was looking at Frank," Helen said. "Same height, same build, same way of standing with his hands on his hips when he's explaining something he's passionate about. He was wearing the flannel shirt I bought him for our 40th anniversary, the red and black one he always wore when we went hiking." I asked if she'd spoken to the man or approached him to get a closer look. Helen explained that she'd been so shocked by the resemblance that she'd initially hung back, trying to convince herself that it was just someone who reminded her of her husband. But the longer she listened to him speak, the more convinced she became that she was looking at Frank Patterson himself. "He wasn't just similar to Frank," she insisted. "He had the same voice, the same mannerisms, the same way of explaining geological formations that made Frank such a popular volunteer guide at national parks back home in Missouri. This man knew details about Zion's history and geology that Frank had spent years studying, information that isn't common knowledge even among experienced hikers. David tried again to suggest that his mother was seeing similarities that weren't really there, but Helen continued with her account. She'd eventually worked up the courage to approach the group and listen more closely to what the man was saying. That's when she'd heard him tell the group a story about visiting Zion for the first time with his wife Helen in 1987, describing details of their honeymoon trip that only Frank would have known. He told them about the rental car breaking down in Springdale and how we had to walk to the park because the shuttle system didn't exist yet, Helen said. He described the picnic lunch I'd packed and how we got caught in a thunderstorm near the Temple of Sinawava. These weren't general stories about visiting Zion. These were specific memories from our personal history that only Frank could have known. That's when Helen had decided to confront the man directly. She'd approached him while he was talking to the group and called out, "Frank? Frank Patterson?" The man had turned to look at her with an expression of recognition, smiled, and said, "Hello, Helen. I wondered when you'd get here." According to Helen, the man who looked exactly like her deceased husband had then excused himself from the tour group and walked over to speak with her privately. He'd asked about her trip to Utah, mentioned that he knew David was with her, and expressed hope that she was finally ready to complete the Angel's Landing hike they'd planned before his death. He knew things that only Frank could have known, Helen insisted. Personal details about our marriage, private conversations we'd had about visiting Zion, even the fact that I'd been afraid to make this trip alone after he died. This wasn't a stranger who reminded me of my husband. This was Frank, somehow alive and working as a trail guide in a place we'd dreamed of visiting together. David had watched this entire interaction from a distance, and his account of what he'd observed was significantly different from his mother's. According to him, his mother had approached a hiking guide who was leading a group tour, called him by his father's name, and then had what appeared to be a one-sided conversation with someone who was obviously confused about why a stranger was treating him like a long-lost relative. The guy was nice about it, David explained, but he clearly had no idea who my mother was or why she was calling him Frank. He tried to be polite while she was talking to him, but I could see that he was uncomfortable with the whole situation. Eventually, he excused himself and led his tour group away from the area. Helen strongly disagreed with her son's interpretation of what had happened. She insisted that the man had not only recognized her, but had known personal details about her life that proved he was actually Frank Patterson. When I asked for specific examples, she mentioned that he'd known about their plans to visit Zion for their 40th anniversary, the heart condition that had prevented Frank from making the trip, and Helen's decision to make the memorial journey with David instead. The situation was obviously distressing for both mother and son, but I was leaning toward David's interpretation of events until Helen mentioned something that changed my assessment of the situation. She said that several other people in the tour group had also seemed to recognize the guide as someone they'd expected to see in the park. There was an older couple, probably in their 70s, who kept looking at him like they couldn't believe their eyes, Helen said, and a middle-aged woman who asked him if he remembered guiding her family on a hike in Glacier National Park 5 years ago. It wasn't just me who thought this man looked familiar. Other people were recognizing him as someone they'd met before. I asked Helen if she'd spoken to any of these other visitors about their reactions to the tour guide. She explained that she'd been too focused on her own interaction with the man she believed was Frank to pay close attention to what others were saying. But she'd definitely observed several people in the group acting like they recognized the guide from previous encounters. This detail made the situation more complex than a simple case of grief-related misidentification. If multiple visitors were recognizing the same tour guide as someone they'd encountered previously, that suggested either the man was a well-known guide who worked in multiple parks, or something more unusual was happening. I decided to investigate further by hiking the Riverside Walk to see if I could locate the tour group and speak with the guide directly. Helen and David agreed to wait at the trailhead while I checked out their report, though David made it clear that he thought this was an unnecessary response to his mother's emotional state. The riverside walk was busier than usual for a December afternoon, probably because the mild weather had attracted visitors who wanted to experience Zion before winter weather made some trails inaccessible. I passed several small groups of hikers, but no organized tour groups with a guide matching Helen's description. About a mile along the trail, I encountered an elderly couple sitting on a bench near one of the interpretive signs. They appeared to be in their 70s, matching Helen's description of people who had seemed to recognize the tour guide. I approached them and asked if they'd recently been part of a guided group on the riverside walk. "Oh, yes," the woman replied immediately. "We just finished the most wonderful tour with a guide who reminded us so much of our son Michael. He died in Iraq 8 years ago, and this young man had the same way of explaining things that made Michael such a good teacher before he enlisted." Her husband nodded in agreement and added, "The guide knew details about military service that seemed very personal to our family's experience. He even mentioned serving in the same region where Michael was stationed, though he appeared too old to have been there at the same time." I asked them to describe the guide they'd been with, and their description matched Helen's account almost exactly. Tall man, probably in his 60s, wearing a red and black flannel shirt, obviously knowledgeable about Zion's history and geology. But they'd recognized him as someone who reminded them of their deceased son, rather than identifying him as a specific person they'd known. "The strangest part," the woman continued, "was that he seemed to know about Michael's military service without us mentioning it. He talked about the challenges of deployment in ways that suggested personal experience, and he knew details about the region where Michael served that most people wouldn't know unless they'd been there themselves." I found 2 other visitors who had been part of the same tour group, and their accounts were similar to what I'd already heard. Each person had recognized the guide as someone who reminded them of a deceased relative or friend, and each had been impressed by his knowledge of personal details that seemed impossible for a stranger to know. But when I asked for more specific information about the guide's appearance or background, I started getting contradictory descriptions. One person described him as tall and thin with gray hair, while another insisted he was medium height with dark hair and a beard. Everyone agreed about the red and black flannel shirt, but their descriptions of other physical characteristics were inconsistent in ways that didn't make sense. I spent 2 hours searching the riverside walk and surrounding areas for any sign of the tour guide or additional tour groups. I checked with other rangers to see if anyone had information about unofficial guides operating in the park, and I reviewed our records for permitted tour operations that might be working the area. I found no evidence that anyone matching the various descriptions had been leading tours on the riverside walk that day. No permits for guided activities, no reports from other rangers about unauthorized guide services, no additional sightings of the man Helen had identified as her deceased husband. When I returned to the trailhead, Helen was still convinced that she'd spoken with Frank Patterson, while David remained certain that his mother had misidentified a stranger due to grief and wishful thinking. But the accounts from other visitors had given me a different perspective on what might have been happening. 4 different people had recognized the same tour guide as someone who reminded them of deceased relatives, and each had described interactions that included personal knowledge the guide shouldn't have possessed. That pattern suggested something more complex than simple misidentification or grief-related hallucinations. I filed an incident report about the unusual tour guide reports, but there wasn't much for the Park Service to investigate without additional evidence. Unauthorized guide services are a violation of park regulations, but we had no clear description of the individual involved and no evidence that any actual violations had occurred. The case was classified as resolved when no additional reports were received about unauthorized tour activities. But 3 days later, I received a phone call that made me reconsider everything about Helen Patterson's account. The caller identified himself as Michael Chen, a park ranger at Glacier National Park in Montana. He'd been researching reports of unusual guide activities after receiving several visitor complaints about someone conducting unauthorized tours who seemed to know personal details about the complainant's deceased relatives. According to Chen, Glacier had received at least 6 reports over the past year of visitors encountering tour guides who bore striking resemblances to their deceased family members. In each case, the guide had demonstrated knowledge of personal details that should have been impossible for a stranger to possess. The weird part, Chen explained, is that every visitor who reported these encounters described the guide differently, but they all mentioned the same red and black flannel shirt. And in every case, the guide seemed to know about deceased relatives of the people he was talking to. Chen had started documenting these reports as part of a larger investigation into unauthorized guide services in national parks. But the pattern of personal knowledge and recognition suggested something beyond simple permit violations. I shared Helen Patterson's account with Chen, and he confirmed that it matched the pattern he'd been investigating. Visitors encountering guides who reminded them of deceased relatives, personal knowledge that couldn't be explained, and physical descriptions that varied between witnesses despite consistent clothing details. Over the following months, Chen and I collaborated on documenting similar reports from other national parks. We found accounts from Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, Yosemite, and several other parks describing encounters with tour guides who seemed to know intimate details about visitors' deceased relatives. The reports shared several consistent elements: guides who appeared knowledgeable about park history and geology, references to deceased family members of the visitors, and physical descriptions that varied between witnesses but often included the same clothing details. What made these reports particularly unsettling was that Park Service records showed no permits for the guide services described by visitors, and no rangers had observed the unauthorized activities, despite the detailed accounts from multiple witnesses. I never encountered the tour guide that Helen Patterson identified as her deceased husband, and I never found any evidence that Frank Patterson or anyone resembling him had been conducting tours at Zion National Park. But I also never found an explanation for how multiple visitors could have had such similar experiences involving personal knowledge that should have been impossible for a stranger to possess. Helen Patterson completed her memorial hike to Angel's Landing the following day, with David's assistance and no further unusual encounters. When I spoke with her before she left the park, she remained convinced that she'd spoken with her deceased husband on the Riverside Walk. "I know how it sounds," she said, "and I know that my son thinks I was seeing things that weren't there. But I also know that Frank was there, somehow, helping other people deal with their own losses while completing the hike we'd planned to do together." The incident report remains in Park Service files as an unresolved case of possible unauthorized guide services. But based on the research Chen and I conducted, it appears to be part of a larger pattern of similar encounters reported at national parks throughout the country. I retired from Park Service 3 weeks after the Helen Patterson incident, but I've continued to follow up on reports of unusual guide encounters. The pattern continues, with visitors from multiple parks reporting interactions with guides who seem to know impossible details about their deceased relatives. Whether these encounters represent some kind of shared psychological phenomenon related to grief and natural settings, or something else entirely, I can't say. What I can say is that Helen Patterson wasn't the first visitor to report this kind of experience, and she won't be the last. The fact that I spent my last day as a ranger investigating a report about a deceased person working as a tour guide seems appropriate somehow. After 31 years of dealing with the unexpected in national parks, it was a reminder that there are still mysteries in these places that defy conventional explanation. And maybe that's as it should be. National parks are supposed to be places where people can connect with something larger than themselves, where the natural world provides experiences that can't be found anywhere else. If some visitors find comfort in believing they've encountered deceased relatives in these settings, perhaps that's just another way the parks serve their intended purpose. But I still wonder about Frank Patterson, and whether Helen really did complete that memorial hike with the husband she'd lost 2 years earlier. Because if she did, then there are aspects of national park experiences that go beyond anything covered in ranger training or park service protocols. And after 31 years of working in places where the impossible sometimes becomes routine, I'm not entirely sure that would surprise me. The GPS coordinates led us to nothing but empty forest, or so we thought until we smelled the coffee brewing. It was 2:15 a.m. on February 28th in the Great Smoky Mountains, and I was 3 hours into what was supposed to be a routine overnight patrol of the backcountry camping areas. The temperature was hovering around 28 degrees with a light snow falling, the kind of night when any sensible person would be indoors next to a fire instead of hiking through the Tennessee wilderness, checking on illegal campers. My name is Daniel Hayes, and I've been working as a ranger in the Smokies for 9 years now. I'm 26 years old, grew up in Gatlinburg before it became the tourist circus it is today, and I've always loved these mountains, even when they're trying to kill me with hypothermia. Winter patrol is usually quiet work. Most illegal campers stick to warmer months, and the few hardy souls who attempt winter camping in the Smokies usually know what they're doing and don't cause problems. But this February night was different from the start. I'd received reports from 3 separate sources about lights and voices coming from an area of the park where camping isn't permitted and where the terrain makes camping nearly impossible anyway. The reports came from legitimate campers at established sites, people who knew the difference between authorized and unauthorized activity. The first report came in around 11 p.m. from a couple camping at Elkmont. They'd seen what looked like campfire light coming from the direction of Walker Camp Prong, about 2 miles from their location. The second report was from a solo backpacker near the Appalachian Trail, who'd heard voices and smelled wood smoke coming from the same general area. The third was from a group of experienced hikers who'd been using night vision equipment for wildlife observation and had seen multiple light sources in a valley that should have been empty. Walker Camp Prong isn't technically off-limits to camping, but it's in a section of the park that's difficult to access and doesn't have any established campsites. The terrain is steep and rocky, with limited flat ground and no reliable water sources during winter months. It's not the kind of place where casual campers would choose to set up, and it's definitely not somewhere you'd want to be during a snowstorm without serious cold weather gear. I started my patrol from the Elkmont area, using a GPS unit to navigate toward the coordinates where the lights had been spotted. The snow was making the trail slippery and visibility was poor, but I've hiked these mountains in worse conditions. What I wasn't prepared for was the smell that started reaching me when I got within half a mile of the reported location. Wood smoke, which I expected, but also coffee brewing, bacon cooking, and what smelled like fresh bread baking. The kind of rich, complex food aromas that you'd associate with a well-equipped camp kitchen, not something you'd expect from illegal campers trying to avoid detection in the middle of a snowstorm. As I got closer, I could see the glow of what looked like multiple campfires through the trees. Not just one fire, but several light sources scattered across an area that should have been too rough and steep for comfortable camping. I approached carefully, not wanting to alarm anyone who might be camping legally in an area I wasn't familiar with, but also aware that multiple campfires suggested a larger group than usually attempts winter camping in this region. I reached a ridge overlooking the valley where the lights had been reported, and what I saw below me made no sense whatsoever. A complete camping village spread across maybe 2 acres of what should have been impossible terrain. Multiple tents, several campfires, a cooking area with what looked like professional camp kitchen equipment, and enough gear to support a large group for an extended period. But there was nobody there. No people moving around the campfires, no voices, no sign of anyone actively using all that equipment. The fires were burning bright and steady, The cooking area had pots and pans on camp stoves with food that was obviously being prepared, but no campers anywhere in sight. I spent 10 minutes observing the scene from the ridge, waiting to see if anyone would emerge from the tents or return from wherever they'd gone. The campfires kept burning without anyone tending them, and I could see steam rising from pots on the camp stoves, suggesting that food was actively being cooked even though no one was present to cook it. I made my way down into the valley, calling out standard ranger identification and asking if anyone was present in the camping area. No response. As I got closer, the food aromas became stronger and more complex. Fresh coffee, bacon, eggs, pancakes, even what smelled like cinnamon rolls baking in a camp oven. The kind of elaborate breakfast spread that would take significant time and effort to prepare. The camping setup was impressive and obviously expensive. 8 large tents arranged in a rough circle around a central fire pit. Each tent was properly staked and positioned, with gear organized outside in neat piles. There were camp chairs, tables, lanterns, cooking equipment that looked like it belonged to a serious outdoor outfitter rather than casual campers. But what made the scene truly bizarre was the condition of the food. I found camp stoves with pans containing bacon that was perfectly cooked but still warm, coffee pots with fresh coffee that was hot enough to steam in the cold air, a camp oven with bread that was still baking, dough that had clearly been rising for hours and was now perfectly golden brown. There were plates set out at multiple camp tables, silverware arranged like someone was expecting guests for a meal, coffee cups with traces of recent use, napkins positioned like people had just stepped away from breakfast. Everything suggested that a large group had been in the middle of preparing and eating an elaborate meal, but had suddenly vanished without cleaning up or extinguishing their fires. I checked each tent systematically, expecting to find sleeping campers or at least personal belongings that would identify who was responsible for this setup. What I found instead was more evidence of recent use but no people. Sleeping bags that were still warm, personal items arranged like people were actively living there, clothes and toiletries suggesting both men and women of various ages. The personal belongings were the most unsettling part of the discovery. I found identification for 12 different people, ranging in age from 25 to 68, from addresses all over the eastern United States, driver's licenses, credit cards, camping permits from other national parks, everything you'd expect people to have with them on an extended camping trip. But according to park records, none of these people had registered for backcountry camping in the Smokies. None of their vehicles were in any of our parking areas, and none of their names appeared on any permit lists or reservation systems. As far as official records were concerned, these 12 people had never been in Great Smoky Mountains National Park at all. I radioed dispatch to report the discovery and request backup for what was clearly an unusual situation. While waiting for additional personnel, I continued documenting the scene and looking for any clue about where the campers might have gone or when they might return. The food situation became more puzzling the longer I examined it. Some items were freshly cooked and still warm, while others appeared to have been sitting for hours. There was coffee that was hot and fresh alongside bacon that was cold but showed no signs of spoilage despite being exposed to winter weather. Bread that was still baking in a camp oven next to pancakes that appeared to have been cooked much earlier but remained in perfect condition. It was like different elements of the meal had been prepared at different times, but all were preserved in the exact condition they'd been in when the cooks had stepped away. No signs of food spoilage, no evidence that wildlife had disturbed anything, no indication that the meal had been sitting unattended for any length of time. My backup arrived around 4 a.m. 2 other rangers and a search and rescue coordinator who'd been called in to help locate the missing campers. When they saw the setup, their reactions were similar to mine. This wasn't the kind of camping arrangement you'd expect from people trying to avoid detection, and it definitely wasn't something that 12 people could have established and then abandoned without leaving clear signs of where they'd gone. We expanded the search to cover several square miles around the camping area, looking for any indication of where 12 people might have gone in the middle of a snowstorm. We found no tracks leading away from the campsite, no signs that anyone had hiked out of the area, no evidence that vehicles had been used to transport people from the location. The search dogs arrived just after sunrise, and their behavior around the campsite was immediately concerning. They picked up clear scent trails indicating that multiple people had been present recently, but the trails seemed to circle around the camping area without leading anywhere else. According to the handlers, it was like 12 people had been present at that location, but had never approached it from any direction or left by any route. We searched for 2 days, expanding the area to include every possible exit route from the valley where the campsite was located. Helicopter searches, ground teams with technical rescue equipment, coordination with neighboring law enforcement agencies. We found no trace of the 12 missing campers anywhere in the region. On the 3rd day, we received phone calls that completely changed our understanding of the situation. 8 of the 12 people whose identification we'd found at the campsite contacted Park Service from their homes in various states, asking about camping gear that they claimed had been stolen from their vehicles during recent visits to other national parks. According to their accounts, none of them had ever been to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. They'd all experienced theft of camping gear from vehicles parked at various national parks over the past 6 months, but none of them had any memory of camping in Tennessee or participating in any group camping activities. The remaining 4 people whose identification we'd found were eventually located through family members who confirmed that they were safe at home and had never been camping in the Smokies. Like the others, they had no explanation for how their personal belongings had ended up at a campsite they claimed never to have visited. Medical examinations found no signs of injury or drug use in any of the 12 individuals, but psychological evaluations suggested possible shared dissociative episodes related to various personal stressors. The official explanation was that the group had somehow experienced collective memory loss related to a camping trip they had no recollection of planning or participating in. But that explanation doesn't account for the physical evidence we found at the campsite. 12 people couldn't have established such an elaborate camping setup in difficult terrain without leaving clear signs of how they'd accessed the location and transported their equipment. And even if they had somehow reached the valley and set up the campsite, they couldn't have vanished without leaving any indication of their departure route. The food evidence was particularly troubling. We found meals in various stages of preparation that suggested people had been actively cooking when they disappeared, but some items appeared to have been sitting unattended for much longer than others. It was like time was moving differently for different elements of the campsite. The camping gear was eventually returned to the individuals whose identification we'd found, but most of them insisted that the equipment didn't belong to them despite clear evidence connecting it to their stolen gear reports. The case was classified as an unexplained discovery with no evidence of criminal activity or safety violations. I've been back to that valley several times since then, during different seasons and weather conditions. The area shows no remaining signs of the elaborate campsite we discovered, and the terrain confirms that it would be extremely difficult for a large group to access the location with the amount of equipment we found there. But I can still smell the coffee and bacon when I think about that February night. I can still see the perfectly cooked meals sitting on camp tables, steam rising from fresh food that was being prepared by people who had somehow vanished without disturbing a single pot or pan. Sometimes I wonder if those 12 campers are still out there somewhere, sitting around a campfire in a place we can't find, wondering why their breakfast got cold and where all the rangers came from. Because the alternative explanation is that we discovered evidence of something that defies everything I understand about how time and space work in the physical world. And after 9 years of working in these mountains, I'm not sure which possibility is more unsettling. Routine safety check becomes missing persons mystery. That's how the incident report was eventually classified. but those 5 words don't begin to capture what happened at Everglades National Park on April 3rd, 2024. I've been a ranger here for 14 years, and I thought I'd seen every kind of situation the South Florida wilderness could produce. Alligator attacks, lost tourists, drug runners, people who underestimate how dangerous the backcountry can be when you're not prepared for it. But what I encountered during what should have been a simple safety inspection challenged everything I thought I understood about how missing persons cases work. My name is Maria Santos. I'm 38 years old, and I've been working in the Everglades since I finished my degree in environmental science at Florida International University. I grew up in Miami, but I've always been drawn to the unique ecosystem of South Florida, and working as a park ranger has allowed me to combine my love of the outdoors with my commitment to conservation and public safety. The call came in around 9:30 in the morning from a family camping at the Flamingo campground. Tom and Linda Harrison from Orlando, visiting with their teenage daughter Katie, had reported seeing what appeared to be a lost child wandering alone near the coastal prairie trail. According to their initial report, they'd observed a young girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, walking by herself in an area where children shouldn't be without adult supervision. The coastal prairie trail is a relatively easy hike that attracts families, but it's also an area where visitors need to be aware of wildlife and potential hazards. A child wandering alone in that area could encounter alligators, venomous snakes, or simply become lost in terrain that all looks similar to inexperienced hikers. Standard protocol required immediate investigation to ensure the child's safety and locate her parents or guardians. I drove out to the Flamingo area and met with the Harrison family at the trailhead. Tom Harrison was probably 50 years old, seemed like an experienced camper, the kind of visitor who takes park safety seriously. Linda was around the same age, and their daughter Katie looked to be about 15. They were all obviously concerned about the child they'd seen, but their account of the encounter was puzzling from the beginning. "We were hiking the trail around 8 this morning," Tom explained, "when we saw this little girl walking by herself about 100 yards ahead of us. She was wearing a bright yellow dress, which seemed like odd clothing for hiking in the Everglades. We called out to her, thinking maybe she'd gotten separated from her family, but she didn't respond." Linda continued the account. "We tried to catch up to her because we were worried about her being alone out there, but every time we got closer, she seemed to move farther away. Not running or anything, just walking at a pace that kept her ahead of us no matter how fast we walked. That didn't sound particularly unusual to me. Children often wander away from parents on hiking trails, and they don't always respond to strangers calling out to them." But Katie Harrison's addition to the story was more concerning. "The weird part," Katie said, "was that she was completely clean. Like, spotless. Her yellow dress looked like it had just been washed and pressed, her hair was perfectly brushed, and she was wearing white shoes that looked brand new. Nobody hiking in the Everglades looks that clean, especially not a little kid walking around by herself." I asked the family to show me where they'd last seen the child, and we hiked about half a mile along the coastal prairie trail to the location they described. It was a section of trail that offered good visibility in all directions, making it unlikely that a child could have simply disappeared into thick vegetation without being seen. The Harrisons pointed out the exact spot where they'd last observed the girl in the yellow dress. According to their account, she'd been walking toward a stand of mangrove trees that bordered a small creek, but when they'd reached that location, there was no sign of her anywhere. I searched the immediate area, looking for any indication of where a child might have gone or any sign that someone had been in the area recently. The trail surface was soft enough to hold footprints, and I found clear evidence of the Harrison family's passage, but no smaller footprints that would indicate a child had been walking in the area. "Are you sure about the location where you saw her?" I asked Tom. "Because I'm not seeing any evidence that a child has been on this section of trail recently." Tom insisted that they'd seen the girl walking in exactly this area, and both Linda and Katie confirmed his account. They seemed genuinely concerned about the child's welfare and frustrated that I couldn't find any trace of her passage. I expanded the search to include the mangrove area and the creek bed, thinking maybe the child had left the trail and gotten lost in the vegetation. But after an hour of systematic searching, I found no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anyone had been in the area other than the Harrison family. I radioed dispatch to report a possible missing child and request backup for a more thorough search operation. While waiting for additional personnel, I asked the Harrisons to describe the child in more detail, hoping to get information that might help identify her parents or determine where she might have come from. She had long brown hair, Linda said. Probably about 10 years old, maybe 11. The yellow dress was old-fashioned looking, like something you'd see in a historical movie. And she was carrying what looked like a small doll or stuffed animal. Katie added, "She never looked back at us even though we were calling to her. It was like she couldn't hear us, or like she was focused on something ahead of her that we couldn't see." I contacted the Flamingo campground to check if any families had reported missing children. No reports of missing children anywhere in the park that day. I also checked with park entrance stations to see if any families with young children had entered the park that morning without checking in at visitor centers. According to park records, only 3 families with children had entered the Everglades that morning, and all were accounted for. The Harrison family themselves, a couple from Tampa with 2 teenage sons who were fishing in Florida Bay, and a family from Jacksonville with a toddler who were visiting the visitor center and hadn't left the main developed area. My backup arrived around noon, 2 other rangers and a search and rescue coordinator. We expanded the search to cover several square miles around the Coastal Prairie Trail, looking for any sign of a missing child or any indication of where she might have gone. We found nothing. No footprints, no personal belongings, no evidence that a child had been anywhere in the area. The search dogs arrived in the early afternoon, and they showed no interest in any scent trails that would suggest a child had been present on the trail. But while we were conducting the expanded search, something unusual happened. We received 2 additional reports of sightings of a child in a yellow dress, both from different locations within the park. The first report came from a wildlife photographer who'd been working near the Anhinga Trail, about 15 miles from where the Harrison family had reported their sighting. He'd seen a young girl in a bright yellow dress walking alone near the boardwalk area, and he'd been concerned enough about her safety to report it to a volunteer at the visitor center. The second report came from a couple hiking the Gumbo Limbo Trail, another location that was miles away from either of the previous sightings. They'd observed a child matching the same description: yellow dress, long brown hair, carrying what looked like a doll, walking by herself in an area where children needed to be with adult supervision. 3 different sightings of the same child in 3 different locations that were too far apart for a 10-year-old to have traveled between them in the time frame involved. Either there were multiple children wearing identical yellow dresses wandering around the park, or something very unusual was happening. I coordinated search teams to investigate all 3 locations, hoping to triangulate the child's current position, or at least find evidence of her presence in one of the areas. But just like at the original sighting location, we found no physical evidence that a child had been in any of those places. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no items dropped or left behind. It was as if multiple people were seeing the same child in different locations, but the child herself was leaving no trace of her passage anywhere in the park. The search continued for the rest of the day, with additional personnel called in from other parks and local law enforcement agencies. We covered hundreds of acres of Everglades terrain, used helicopters for aerial searches, and deployed every available resource for locating a missing child. But we never found any trace of the girl in the yellow dress. No physical evidence, no additional sightings after the initial 3 reports, no indication of where she might have come from or where she might have gone. The case was eventually classified as unfounded when we couldn't locate any evidence that a child had actually been missing. The theory was that multiple visitors had experienced similar optical illusions, or misidentified wildlife or other objects as a child in bright clothing. But that explanation doesn't account for the consistent details in all three sighting reports. Multiple witnesses describing the same clothing, the same physical characteristics, the same behavior patterns. It's statistically unlikely that three separate groups of visitors would have identical hallucinations involving such specific details. I researched the park's historical records, looking for any information about previous sightings of unaccompanied children or similar unexplained incidents. What I found was a pattern of similar reports dating back over 20 years. At least once each year, sometimes more often, park visitors report seeing a young girl in distinctive clothing walking alone in areas where children shouldn't be without supervision. The clothing descriptions vary, sometimes a yellow dress, sometimes other bright colors, but the reports always involve the same elements. A child who appears lost but doesn't respond to offers of help, who seems unusually clean and well-dressed for wilderness hiking, and who leaves no physical evidence of her presence. In every case, extensive searches find no trace of the reported child, and no families report missing children that match the descriptions provided by witnesses. The sightings are eventually classified as unfounded, but the pattern continues year after year. The most disturbing aspect of these historical reports is that several witnesses have described the child as appearing to be from a different time period. The clothing, the hairstyle, even the doll or toy she's sometimes seen carrying, all described as looking old-fashioned or historical rather than contemporary. I don't have an explanation for what the Harrison family saw on the coastal prairie trail that morning, or for the similar sightings reported by other visitors throughout the day. I can't explain why multiple witnesses would describe the same child in the same distinctive clothing, or why such reports have been consistent over more than 2 decades. What I can say is that the Everglades are full of mysteries that we don't fully understand. This is a place where the normal rules don't always apply, where the boundary between civilization and wilderness is thin, and where people sometimes encounter things that challenge their understanding of what's possible. Whether the girl in the yellow dress is a recurring hallucination experienced by multiple visitors, or something else entirely, I can't say. But I do know that the Harrison family saw something that morning that concerned them enough to report it, and that their description matched dozens of similar reports from other concerned visitors over the years. Sometimes when I'm doing patrol on the coastal prairie trail, I find myself looking for a flash of yellow among the vegetation, wondering if I'll be the next person to see the child who appears and disappears without leaving any trace of her passage through one of America's most unique wilderness areas. The family photo was still warm when we found it buried 3 feet underground, and that's when I knew we'd stumbled onto something that couldn't be explained by normal park maintenance procedures. It was May 15th, 2024, and what started as a routine trail repair project at Denali National Park had turned into the most bizarre discovery of my 16-year career as a park ranger. I'm still not sure what we uncovered that spring morning, but I know it changed the way I think about what's possible in the Alaskan wilderness. My name is Robert Mackenzie. I'm 43 years old, and I've been working at Denali since I moved to Alaska from Montana in 2008. I grew up around mountains, but nothing prepared me for the scale and wildness of interior Alaska. Denali is a place where nature operates by its own rules, where the sheer size of the landscape makes you feel insignificant, and where the long winter darkness can play tricks on your mind even when you're an experienced outdoorsman. The trail maintenance project was scheduled for the Savage River Loop, a popular day hiking trail that sees heavy use during the summer tourist season. We'd had significant erosion damage during spring thaw, and several sections of the trail needed to be rerouted and reinforced before the peak visitor period began in June. Standard maintenance work that we do every spring, nothing that should have been complicated or unusual. My crew consisted of 4 people, myself as crew leader, Jennifer Walsh, who'd been with Park Service for 8 years, Tom Bradley, who was new to Denali but had experience with trail work in the lower 48, and Sarah Kim, a seasonal worker who was studying environmental science at University of Alaska Fairbanks. We were all experienced with trail maintenance and familiar with the kinds of things you typically find when doing excavation work in national parks. We started work around 7 a.m., using hand tools to dig out damaged sections of trail and prepare the ground for new trail surface materials. The work was progressing normally until around 10:30, when Jennifer's shovel hit something metallic buried about 18 inches below the trail surface.
"Mackenzie,"
she called out,
"I think I found something down here that doesn't belong."
She was working on a section where we were widening the trail to improve drainage, digging in an area that should have been undisturbed forest soil for decades, if not longer. I walked over to examine what she'd found, expecting to see the usual debris that sometimes gets buried in wilderness areas. Old camping equipment left by careless visitors, maybe some historic trash from the early days of the park, possibly even artifacts from indigenous peoples who'd used these areas long before Denali became a national park. What Jennifer had uncovered was the corner of what appeared to be a metal container, partially buried and obviously placed rather than naturally deposited. We carefully excavated around the object, revealing a weatherproof case about the size of a small suitcase, the kind that photographers use to protect expensive equipment during travel. The case was locked, but not corroded, despite being buried in soil that would have subjected it to multiple freeze-thaw cycles. Tom suggested we open it to see if it contained anything that might identify its owner, thinking maybe someone had buried valuable equipment intending to retrieve it later. Inside the case, we found something that made no sense given its burial location and the apparent age of the container. Recent photographs, dozens of them, showing what appeared to be family activities in and around Denali National Park. Hiking photos, camping pictures, scenic shots of landmarks I recognized immediately as locations within the park. But these weren't old photographs that had been buried for years. They were digital prints on modern photo paper, with timestamps showing they'd been taken within the past 6 months. Photos of a family that appeared to include 2 parents and 3 children, engaged in typical park activities like wildlife viewing and scenic hiking. Jennifer examined the photos more closely and noticed something that made the discovery even more puzzling. "These pictures were taken in winter," she said. "Look at the snow conditions and the clothing they're wearing. But look at this timestamp, February 18th, 2024. We had the park road closed to public vehicle traffic all winter. How did a family get to these locations to take these pictures?" She was right. Several of the photographs showed the family at locations that were inaccessible to visitors during winter months when the park road is closed beyond the first few miles. Locations that would require cross-country travel of 20 or 30 miles through wilderness areas in extreme cold and deep snow conditions. The photos showed the family engaged in activities that would have been nearly impossible during February in interior Alaska. Camping in lightweight tents during conditions that would have required extreme cold weather gear, children playing outside in temperatures that would have been life-threatening without proper protection, scenic photography at locations that experienced park rangers would have difficulty reaching during winter months. Tom pointed out another inconsistency in the photographs. "Look at the lighting and shadows in these pictures," he said. "These were taken during daylight hours. But in February at this latitude, we only get a few hours of twilight. There's no way to get this kind of natural lighting for photography during winter months." Sarah was examining the photo paper and printing quality, and her observation was even more disturbing. "These prints are warm," she said. "Not just room temperature, but actually warm to the touch, like they just came out of a photo printer. And look at this. Some of them are still sticky on the back, like the adhesive hasn't fully dried yet." We were holding photographs that appeared to have been printed very recently, but they'd been found buried in a waterproof case at least 18 inches underground in an area where the soil showed no signs of recent disturbance. The burial site was in the middle of a section of trail that hadn't been maintained or excavated in several years. I made the decision to expand our excavation around the area where we'd found the photo case, thinking maybe we'd discover additional buried items that might explain how recent photographs had ended up buried in what appeared to be an undisturbed location. What we found during the expanded excavation was even more puzzling than the original discovery. More buried containers, all weatherproof and all containing recent items that should never have been buried in those locations. A GPS unit with waypoints marked for locations throughout Denali, including coordinates for places that are restricted to researchers and park personnel. The GPS showed recent activity, with tracks indicating extensive travel throughout the park during months when such travel would have been impossible for civilian visitors. Personal belongings that appeared to belong to the family in the photographs. Clothing sized for adults and children, all showing signs of recent use but no indication of the kind of wear you'd expect from extreme cold weather conditions. Clean camping gear that looked like it had been used recently but showed no signs of the harsh treatment that Alaska winter camping would inevitably produce. Most disturbing was a family journal with entries dated throughout the winter months, describing camping and hiking activities during periods when the park was closed to public access, and when weather conditions would have made such activities potentially fatal for anyone without specialized training and equipment. The journal entries described perfect weather conditions during days when park records showed blizzard conditions and temperatures of -40 degrees Fahrenheit. They mentioned wildlife encounters during months when most animals would have been in hibernation or survival mode. They described hiking to locations that would have required days of cross-country travel through terrain that was impassable during winter months. Sarah noticed something about the handwriting in the journal that made the discovery even more unsettling. "The ink in these entries is fresh," she said. "Not just unfaded, but actually wet in some places, like someone was writing in this journal minutes before we found it." We contacted Park Dispatch to report our unusual discovery and request guidance on how to proceed. Finding buried personal belongings during maintenance work isn't unprecedented, but finding recently used items buried in locations that showed no signs of recent excavation required investigation by law enforcement personnel. The response from dispatch was that no permits had been issued for winter camping or extensive backcountry travel during the time period indicated by the photographs and journal entries. No special use permits, no research authorizations, no exceptions that would have allowed civilian visitors to access restricted areas during winter months. Moreover, park entrance records showed no visitors matching the description of the family in the photographs during the time periods when the journal entries and photo timestamps indicated they were present in the park. As far as official records were concerned, this family had never been in Denali National Park at all. We spent the rest of the day excavating the area where we'd found the buried containers, hoping to find additional evidence that might explain how recent personal belongings had ended up buried in undisturbed soil. But our excavation revealed something that made the mystery even deeper. The soil layers around the buried containers showed clear stratification, indicating that the ground had been undisturbed for several years. No evidence of recent digging, no mixed soil layers that would indicate someone had excavated and refilled the burial sites. According to soil analysis, the containers had been buried in their current locations for at least 3 years, despite containing items that were clearly from recent months. The trail maintenance project was suspended while park law enforcement investigated the discovery. Additional personnel were brought in to conduct a thorough excavation of the area, using archaeological techniques to document exactly how and when the items had been buried. The investigation found 12 different burial sites containing personal belongings that appeared to belong to the same family. Items spanning several years but all showing signs of recent use, all buried in soil that showed no signs of recent disturbance, all containing evidence of activities that should have been impossible during the time periods indicated. The case was eventually turned over to federal authorities when Park Service personnel couldn't develop any reasonable explanation for the discoveries. The buried items were classified as evidence in an ongoing investigation, but no charges were ever filed because no laws appeared to have been broken. The family members shown in the photographs were eventually identified through facial recognition software and contacted by federal investigators. According to their accounts, they were residents of Seattle who had never been to Alaska and had no knowledge of how their likenesses had appeared in photographs taken at Denali National Park. Medical and psychological examinations found no evidence that any of the family members had ever been to Alaska, and their work and school records confirmed their presence in Seattle during the time periods when the photographs and journal entries indicated they were camping in Denali. Yet the photographs clearly showed these same people engaged in extensive outdoor activities in locations that were unmistakably within the park boundaries. The trail maintenance project was eventually completed, but the section of trail where we made the discoveries was rerouted around the excavation sites. The area has been designated as a research location, with ongoing studies attempting to understand how recently used personal belongings could have been buried for years in undisturbed soil. I've been back to that section of the park many times since then, and I always wonder what else might be buried beneath the surface of what appears to be pristine wilderness. Because if we found evidence of impossible activities in one small area during routine maintenance work, what might be hidden in the millions of acres of Denali that have never been excavated? The incident report remains classified as an ongoing investigation, but everyone involved in the discovery knows that we encountered something that defies conventional explanation. Personal belongings that were simultaneously old and new, photographs of people who had never been to Alaska engaged in activities that would have been impossible during the time periods indicated, and evidence of extensive park use by visitors who, according to all official records, had never visited the park at all. Sometimes when I'm doing trail maintenance now, I find myself wondering what we might uncover next, and whether I really want to know the answer to that question. Routine safety check becomes missing persons mystery. That's how I'd describe what happened during what should have been the most boring assignment of my career at Glacier National Park. It was August 14th, 2024, and I was conducting routine safety inspections of backcountry trail shelters before the end of summer season. These inspections are usually straightforward. Check the structural integrity of emergency shelters, document any needed repairs, ensure that safety equipment is properly stocked and functional. Nothing that should have resulted in a missing persons investigation that remains unsolved 4 months later. My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm 27 years old, and I've been working as a ranger at Glacier for 3 years now. I grew up in Montana, spent most of my childhood in the outdoors, and I've always been comfortable working alone in remote wilderness areas. Safety inspections are routine work that experienced rangers can complete efficiently without encountering anything more dangerous than the occasional curious wildlife. The assignment took me to the Sperry Trail area, about 8 miles from the nearest road and accessible only by hiking through some of Glacier's most spectacular but challenging terrain. The trail leads to several backcountry shelters that serve as emergency refuges for hikers who encounter sudden weather changes or medical emergencies in remote areas. I started the hike around 7 a.m., carrying standard safety inspection equipment and enough supplies for what I expected to be a full day of hiking and documentation. The weather was perfect for backcountry travel: clear skies, temperature in the 70s, minimal wind. Ideal conditions for completing safety inspections efficiently and getting back to the trailhead before dark. The first 2 shelters I inspected were exactly what I expected to find. Well-maintained structures with minor issues that I documented for future maintenance crews. Missing or damaged safety equipment that I replaced from supplies I was carrying. Standard wear and tear that accumulates over a season of use by hikers and backpackers. But when I reached the 3rd shelter, located about 6 miles from the trailhead in a remote valley that sees relatively few visitors, I found something that didn't match the normal pattern of shelter use and maintenance. The shelter appeared to have been recently occupied, but not by typical backcountry hikers. Personal belongings were arranged throughout the interior space in a way that suggested someone had been living there for an extended period, rather than using it as an emergency refuge during bad weather. Clothing, toiletries, cooking equipment, and personal items were organized like someone had established a permanent residence in what was supposed to be an emergency shelter for temporary use. There were modifications to the interior space that showed considerable time and effort. Shelving built from forest materials, a more elaborate sleeping area than the basic platform provided in the original structure, even artwork created from natural materials and attached to the walls. But there was no one present in the shelter, and no indication of when the occupant might return or where they might have gone. The personal belongings suggested recent use, clothing that appeared clean and recently washed, food supplies that were fresh and properly stored, even toiletries that showed signs of daily use. I documented everything I found and began examining the personal belongings to determine who might have been using the shelter and whether they had proper permits for extended backcountry residence. What I discovered raised immediate concerns about both safety and regulations compliance. The personal belongings included identification for someone named Marcus Thompson, age 34, with an address in Seattle. Driver's license, credit cards, and other documents that appeared genuine and current, but also camping permits and backcountry reservations for multiple national parks that showed dates spanning several months and locations across the western United States. The permits were all properly issued and appeared legitimate, but they represented an itinerary that would have been physically impossible for one person to complete. Permits for camping in Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, Yosemite, and several other parks with overlapping dates that would have required Marcus Thompson to be in multiple locations simultaneously. Moreover, according to the dates on the permits and the apparent duration of his residence in the glacier shelter, Marcus Thompson had been using this location as a base camp while supposedly camping in other national parks hundreds of miles away. I contacted dispatch to report finding evidence of long-term occupation of an emergency shelter by someone whose permit documentation didn't match his apparent activities. While waiting for guidance about how to proceed, I continued examining the shelter and the personal belongings to gather more information about the situation. The modifications Marcus Thompson had made to the shelter were extensive and showed considerable skill in wilderness construction techniques, but they also showed signs of having been completed over a period of weeks or months, suggesting he'd been residing in the location far longer than any backcountry permits would have allowed. More concerning was evidence that he hadn't been alone during his extended residence. Personal belongings that appeared to belong to at least 2 other people, cooking equipment sized for group meals rather than solo camping, and sleeping arrangements that had been modified to accommodate multiple occupants. But I found no identification or permit documentation for the additional people who had apparently been sharing the shelter with Marcus Thompson. It was as if he'd been issued permits for solo backcountry camping, but had been hosting other people in the emergency shelter without any official documentation of their presence. I spent several hours documenting the scene and trying to understand the timeline of occupation and the current status of the people who had been using the shelter. The evidence suggested recent habitation, personal hygiene items that had been used recently, food preparation areas that showed signs of recent cooking, even a journal with entries dated within the past week. But there was no indication of where Marcus Thompson and his companions had gone or when they might return. No notes explaining their absence, no evidence of planned departure, no indication that they intended to return to retrieve their extensive personal belongings. The journal entries were particularly puzzling because they described daily activities and observations that didn't match the location where I'd found the shelter. Entries describing desert landscapes, coastal environments, and mountain terrain that was clearly not from the Glacier National Park region. The entries read like someone who was simultaneously experiencing multiple different environments. describing wildlife encounters and weather conditions from various ecosystems on the same dates. It was as if Marcus Thompson was somehow present in multiple national parks at the same time, documenting experiences from locations that were hundreds of miles apart. I made the decision to wait at the shelter until evening, hoping that Marcus Thompson or his companions would return and I could speak with them about their extended use of the emergency facility and their apparent permit violations. But as hours passed without any sign of the shelter's occupants, I became increasingly concerned about their welfare and whereabouts. Just before sunset, I discovered something that changed my understanding of the entire situation. A trail leading away from the shelter that I hadn't noticed during my initial inspection, heading in a direction that didn't correspond to any established trails in the area. The trail showed clear signs of recent use, with footprints indicating multiple people had traveled in both directions. But when I followed the trail for about a quarter mile, it led to the edge of a cliff that dropped several hundred feet to the valley floor below. The trail simply ended at the cliff edge, with no indication of where the people who had been using it could have gone. The footprints led directly to the cliff edge and stopped. No signs of rappelling equipment, no alternative routes away from the cliff, no evidence that anyone had turned around and returned the way they'd come. It was as if multiple people had walked to the edge of the cliff and then vanished. I returned to the shelter and contacted dispatch to report a possible missing persons situation involving at least 3 people who had been using an emergency shelter for extended residence, but had apparently disappeared under circumstances that suggested they might have fallen from a cliff or encountered some other emergency. Search and rescue operations began the following morning, with teams covering the area below the cliff and searching for any sign of Marcus Thompson and his companions. But after 3 days of intensive searching, no trace of the missing people was found anywhere in the region. The investigation expanded to include verification of the permit documentation I'd found in the shelter. What authorities discovered was even more puzzling than the original disappearance. Marcus Thompson was contacted at his home in Seattle, where he'd been living and working normally for the past several months. According to his account, he had never been to Glacier National Park and had no knowledge of how his identification had ended up in a backcountry shelter he claimed never to have visited. The camping permits found in the shelter were all legitimate and had been properly issued, but Marcus Thompson had no memory of applying for them or visiting any of the national parks where the permits were supposed to be used. Bank records showed charges for permit fees and camping equipment, but Marcus insisted he had no recollection of making those purchases. Medical examination found no signs of injury or drug use, but psychological evaluation suggested possible dissociative episodes related to work stress. The official explanation was that Marcus Thompson had experienced some form of memory loss related to an extended camping trip he had no conscious recollection of planning or completing. But that explanation didn't account for the physical impossibility of the permit timeline or the evidence that he'd been present in multiple national parks simultaneously. And it certainly didn't explain what had happened to the companions who had apparently been sharing the shelter with him. The personal belongings found in the shelter were eventually returned to Marcus Thompson, but he insisted that most of the equipment didn't belong to him, despite clear evidence connecting it to his credit card accounts. The case was classified as a resolved missing persons report when Marcus Thompson was located safely at his home. But the fundamental questions about what I'd discovered during that routine safety inspection remain unanswered. How had someone established an extended residence in an emergency shelter while simultaneously being documented as present in multiple other locations? Who were the companions who had shared the shelter but left no identification or official documentation? And where did they go when they walked to the edge of that cliff? I've completed dozens of safety inspections since then, but I always wonder what I might find in the next remote shelter, and whether the people whose belongings I discover will turn out to exist in the places and times where the evidence suggests they should be found. Emergency rescue call from disconnected phone That's what the dispatch log shows for the incident that changed my perspective on everything I thought I understood about communication technology and emergency response procedures. It was July 4th, 2023, Independence Day, and I was working a holiday shift at Joshua Tree National Park when we received a call that shouldn't have been possible using any known method of telephone communication. My name is Catherine Williams. I'm 29 years old, and I've been working as a ranger at Joshua Tree for 5 years now. I transferred here from Yosemite because I wanted to experience desert wilderness after growing up around the mountains and forests of Northern California. Joshua Tree in summer is brutal. Temperatures that can kill unprepared visitors, terrain that's unforgiving to anyone who makes poor decisions, and an environment where small mistakes can quickly become life-threatening emergencies. I dispatched 2 search teams to the coordinates Rodriguez had provided, but I also sent a 3rd team to the location where our GPS tracking showed the phone signal was originating. If the caller was actually in trouble, I wanted to make sure we were searching in the right place, regardless of what our communications equipment was telling us. The search teams reached both locations within 45 minutes of the original call. The coordinates Rodriguez had provided led to an area near Ryan Mountain that was accessible by established trails and showed signs of recent hiking activity. But there was no sign of Rodriguez or his hiking partner anywhere in the area. The 2nd search team, dispatched to the GPS coordinates our equipment was tracking, found themselves standing in the middle of empty desert with no hikers, no emergency situation, and no indication that anyone had been in that area recently. The GPS location was in terrain that would have been extremely difficult to reach on foot, requiring technical climbing skills and equipment that casual day hikers wouldn't possess. Meanwhile, Rodriguez remained on the line, providing continuous updates about his partner's condition and answering questions about their location and the circumstances that had led to their emergency. He described landmarks that were accurate for the area he claimed to be in, gave weather conditions that matched what our teams were observing, and demonstrated knowledge of the park that suggested he was an experienced visitor who knew the area well. But our search teams couldn't find any trace of him or his hiking partner at either of the locations we were searching. Janet asked Rodriguez to describe his surroundings in more detail, hoping to pinpoint his location more accurately. His description matched the Ryan Mountain area perfectly: the distinctive rock formations, the scattered Joshua trees, the views of other landmarks that would be visible from that location. But he also mentioned seeing a stone structure that he described as some kind of old building or ruins that shouldn't have existed in that area. I contacted park historians and archaeologists to ask about any known structures in the Ryan Mountain area. According to their records, there were no historic buildings, ruins, or man-made structures anywhere in the region Rodriguez was describing. Joshua Tree has been surveyed extensively for archaeological and historical resources, and no stone buildings have ever been documented in that section of the park. The call continued for over 2 hours, with Rodriguez providing regular updates about his partner's condition and maintaining communication, while our search teams expanded their efforts to cover a wider area. But the longer we talked to him, the more obvious it became that we were dealing with something outside normal emergency response parameters. Rodriguez's descriptions of his partner's medical condition were detailed and accurate, consistent with severe heat exhaustion progressing toward heat stroke. He was following proper first aid procedures and answering medical questions in ways that suggested he had wilderness first aid training. But when our medical personnel asked him to perform specific assessment techniques, the results he reported were inconsistent with someone who was supposedly unconscious. Janet asked Rodriguez to take photographs of his location and his partner's condition using his phone's camera, thinking that visual information might help us pinpoint their location or assess the medical situation more accurately. Rodriguez agreed and said he was taking the requested photographs, but our technical systems never received any images despite his phone apparently having enough signal strength to maintain clear voice communication for hours. By 6 p.m., we had search teams covering over 20 square miles around the Ryan Mountain area, helicopter support conducting aerial searches, and coordination with local law enforcement agencies. We'd committed enormous resources to an emergency response operation, but we hadn't found any evidence that Rodriguez or his hiking partner actually existed. The call finally ended around 6:30 p.m. when Rodriguez said he was going to try to carry his partner to a location where they might be more visible to search aircraft. He thanked us for our assistance and said he would call back if his partner's condition deteriorated further. The line went dead, and we never heard from him again. But according to our technical logs, the call had never actually ended. Our communications equipment showed that the line remained open for another 3 hours, with no voice activity, but continuing to receive data indicating that the phone was still connected and still transmitting GPS coordinates from the impossible underground location. The search operation continued until after midnight, with teams combing every accessible area within miles of the reported locations. We found no trace of Rodriguez, his hiking partner, or any evidence that anyone matching their descriptions had been in Joshua Tree National Park that day. The incident was eventually classified as a false emergency call, possibly involving someone using sophisticated equipment to spoof phone numbers and GPS coordinates. But that explanation doesn't account for Rodriguez's detailed knowledge of the park, his accurate descriptions of local landmarks, or the background sounds that were consistent with someone actually being in the Joshua Tree wilderness. The phone number Rodriguez had called from was investigated by federal authorities as part of a broader inquiry into emergency call spoofing. But the investigation found no evidence of telecommunications fraud or any technology that could produce the specific combination of impossible characteristics we'd observed during the call. 6 months later, we received a missing persons report that gave the entire incident a different and more disturbing context. A family from San Diego reported that their son Michael Rodriguez had disappeared during a hiking trip to Joshua Tree National Park on July 4, 2023. He'd been hiking with a friend, and both men had failed to return from what was supposed to be a day hike in the Ryan Mountain area. According to the missing persons report, Michael Rodriguez owned a cell phone with the same number that had called our emergency line on the day he disappeared. The phone had been reported stolen in January 2023, but according to his family, Michael had continued using the device despite the theft report being filed incorrectly by someone else. The search for Michael Rodriguez and his hiking partner resumed, but after weeks of intensive searching, no trace of either man was ever found. The case remains open as an unsolved disappearance, with no evidence to explain what happened to them or how Michael Rodriguez managed to call for help using a phone that had been reported disconnected. I've handled dozens of emergency calls since then, but I always wonder whether the voices I'm hearing belong to people I'll actually be able to help. Because if Michael Rodriguez really was lost in Joshua Tree when he called that July afternoon, then our failure to find him represents something more troubling than just a failed search and rescue operation. Sometimes I think about that call when I'm doing patrol in the Ryan Mountain area, wondering if there are stone ruins hidden somewhere in terrain we've never properly searched, or if there are underground spaces where lost hikers might be trapped beyond the reach of conventional rescue operations. Because if our communications equipment was somehow receiving a call from someone who was 200 feet underground, then Joshua Tree might contain mysteries that we haven't even begun to understand, and missing persons cases that we haven't learned how to solve. Wildlife tracking leads to human behavior patterns. That's the conclusion I reached after spending 6 months documenting what I initially thought was unusual bear activity in Olympic National Park. But by the time I understood what I was actually tracking, the behavioral patterns had become so complex and purposeful that I had to consider possibilities that fall outside normal wildlife management protocols. My name is Lisa Thompson. I'm 31 years old, and I've been working as a wildlife biologist for Olympic National Park for 7 years. I specialize in large mammal behavior, particularly the black bear population that inhabits the temperate rainforest regions of the Olympic Peninsula. I have a master's degree in wildlife biology from University of Washington, and I've published research on bear behavior patterns in Pacific Northwest ecosystems. The unusual activity began in March 2024, when I started receiving reports from backpackers and day hikers about bear behavior that didn't match normal patterns for black bears in this region. Instead of the typical food-seeking behavior you'd expect from bears emerging from winter dormancy, witnesses were describing organized, almost purposeful activities that suggested problem-solving abilities far beyond what black bears typically demonstrate. The first report came from an experienced backpacker named David Chen, who'd been camping in the Ho River Valley when he observed what he described as a bear systematically organizing camping equipment that had been scattered by wind. According to Chen, the bear spent over an hour arranging gear in neat piles, separating items by type and size in ways that suggested understanding of human organizational principles. Chen had photographed the bear's activity, and the images showed behavior that was unprecedented in my experience studying black bear populations. The bear was handling camping equipment carefully rather than investigating it for food sources, positioning items in arrangements that served no obvious purpose for bear survival or territory marking. I dismissed the initial report as anthropomorphization, the common tendency for people to attribute human-like motivations to animal behavior they don't understand. But over the following weeks, I received similar reports from multiple independent sources, all describing black bear behavior that seemed organized and purposeful rather than driven by typical survival instincts. A family from Seattle reported observing a bear constructing what appeared to be a shelter using fallen branches and forest debris, working for several hours to create a structure that was more sophisticated than typical bear day beds or winter dens. A solo hiker described watching a bear collect and organize natural materials like rocks and pine cones into patterns that resembled human artistic arrangements. By April, I was receiving reports of unusual bear activity almost weekly, all from the same general region of the park. The consistency of the reports and the credibility of the witnesses convinced me that something unusual was happening that warranted scientific investigation. I established a research protocol to document and analyze the reported bear behavior, using trail cameras, GPS tracking, and direct observation to gather data about whatever was causing these unusual activity reports. What I discovered over the following months challenged everything I thought I understood about black bear intelligence and social behavior. The trail cameras I positioned throughout the area captured hundreds of hours of footage showing black bear behavior that defied conventional understanding of the species. Bears working together in coordinated groups to accomplish tasks that served no obvious survival purpose. Construction activities that produced structures resembling human shelters but built using techniques that no bear should have been able to develop independently. Most disturbing was footage showing bears manipulating human-made objects in ways that demonstrated understanding of their intended purposes. Bears operating camping equipment correctly, using tools to accomplish specific tasks, even appearing to communicate with each other about complex problem-solving activities. The behavioral patterns I was documenting were so far outside normal parameters for black bear intelligence that I began to question whether I was actually observing bear behavior or something else entirely. The level of organization, planning, and cooperation I was recording suggested cognitive abilities that shouldn't exist in black bear populations. I contacted colleagues at other research institutions, sharing video footage and behavioral data to get expert opinions about what I was observing. The responses ranged from skepticism about the authenticity of my documentation to suggestions that I might be observing a previously unknown subspecies of black bear with enhanced cognitive abilities. But as my research continued into the summer months, the behavioral patterns became even more complex and purposeful. The bears were not only demonstrating advanced problem-solving abilities, but they were also displaying behavior that appeared to be deliberately designed to interact with human visitors to the park. Trail camera footage showed bears positioning themselves along popular hiking trails at times when they were most likely to encounter human visitors. Bears approaching campsites and engaging in organized activities within view of campers, almost as if they were performing for human observers. The behavior was so sophisticated and purposeful that I began to suspect I wasn't documenting unusual bear activity at all, but some form of human activity that was being misidentified as bear behavior by park visitors and captured on my research cameras. But detailed analysis of the footage confirmed that the subjects I was observing were definitely black bears, not humans in costumes or any other form of misidentification. DNA analysis of hair samples confirmed that the bears displaying unusual behavior were genetically consistent with normal black bear populations in the region. The breakthrough in understanding what I was actually documenting came in August, when I received a report that changed the entire nature of my research. A park visitor reported observing what appeared to be a bear teaching a human how to build a shelter using forest materials, with the bear demonstrating techniques and the human following the bear's instructions. I initially dismissed this report as impossible, but when I reviewed trail camera footage from the area where the interaction had been observed, I found video evidence that supported the visitor's account. Footage showing a black bear and a human figure working together on construction projects, with the bear apparently taking the lead role in directing the activity. The human figure in the footage was difficult to identify due to distance and forest lighting conditions, but appeared to be an adult male wearing standard hiking clothing. More importantly, the interaction between the bear and human showed none of the defensive or aggressive behavior you'd expect from a wild bear encounter. Instead, the footage showed what appeared to be cooperative behavior, with both the bear and human working toward common goals in ways that suggested ongoing familiarity and communication between them. The bear was not demonstrating typical defensive postures or maintaining distance from the human, and the human was not showing signs of fear or caution that would be normal in a wild bear encounter. Over the following weeks, I captured additional footage of similar interactions between bears and human figures, all showing cooperative behavior that defied everything I understood about black bear social patterns and human-wildlife relationships. The humans in the footage were always difficult to identify clearly, but appeared to be different individuals rather than the same person repeatedly interacting with bears. Some appeared to be experienced outdoors people based on their clothing and equipment, while others seemed less familiar with wilderness settings. What made these interactions even more puzzling was that none of the humans involved ever registered with park authorities as researchers, photographers, or anyone with official permission to engage in close contact with wildlife. According to park records, no permits had been issued for any activities that would involve the kind of human-bear interactions I was documenting. I expanded my research to include attempts to identify and interview the humans who appeared in my trail camera footage, hoping to understand how they developed relationships with wild bears and what they were trying to accomplish through their interactions. But despite months of investigation, I was never able to identify any of the humans who appeared in the footage. They didn't match any park employees, researchers, or registered visitors during the time periods when the interactions were recorded. It was as if they appeared in the forest specifically to interact with the bears, and then vanished without leaving any trace of their identity or presence in the park. The research project was eventually suspended when I couldn't develop any scientific explanation for the behaviors I was documenting, or identify the humans who were apparently involved in cooperative activities with wild bear populations. My final report concluded that I had documented bear behavior that exceeded known parameters for black bear intelligence and social organization, but that the involvement of unidentified humans in the behavioral patterns made it impossible to determine whether the observations represented unusual wildlife behavior or some form of human activity that I didn't understand. The trail cameras remain in place and the unusual behavioral patterns continue to be documented. Bears in the Olympic National Park region continue to display organizational abilities and cooperative behaviors that shouldn't exist in wild bear populations, and they continue to interact with unidentified humans in ways that suggest ongoing relationships rather than chance encounters. I've published preliminary findings about the unusual bear behavior, but the scientific community remains skeptical about behavioral patterns that fall so far outside established understanding of black bear capabilities. The involvement of unidentified humans in the documented activities raises questions about research ethics and wildlife management that have no clear answers. Sometimes when I'm doing field research in the areas where I documented the unusual behavior, I wonder if I'm being observed by the same bears and humans who appeared in my trail camera footage. Because if wild bears really are capable of the complex social behaviors I documented, and if they've somehow developed cooperative relationships with humans who leave no other trace of their presence in the park, then there are aspects of wildlife management that we haven't even begun to understand. And the possibility that I was never actually studying bear behavior at all, but some form of human activity that I'm not equipped to recognize or analyze, is something that keeps me awake at night wondering what else might be happening in the wilderness areas that fall outside the scope of conventional scientific investigation.